Could you ever love someone and then kill for an idea? Not out of rage, not in self-defense, but calmly, purposefully, because you believed it was necessary, because you believed it was good. The thought sounds impossible, at odds with everything you know about love. But your brain, the same one that feels joy, affection, and tenderness, is also capable of something else, something colder. It can justify anything. It only needs a reason. Love isn't a shield against cruelty. Sometimes it's the engine behind it. You've seen it in history. Genocides not carried out by monsters, but by neighbors, parents, teachers. People who kissed their children goodnight, then went to work exterminating others. Not because they hated, but because they believed. They believed the others were a threat, or inferior, or evil. And they believed protecting their own, protecting those they loved, required purity, sacrifice, removal. You think hatred causes genocide, but often it's love twisted into duty. Love weaponized into justification. Your brain doesn't warn you when this shift begins. It rewards you. It floods you with certainty, with belonging, with pride. It tells you you're doing what's right. It makes cruelty feel like responsibility. This isn't something broken inside people. It's something built in. The same circuits that drive compassion also enable exclusion. The same brain that forms attachments is the one that categorizes, otherizes, rationalizes. You think empathy protects you, but empathy is narrow. It focuses, intensifies. You can feel enormous compassion for your group while ignoring the suffering of others. Or worse, seeing that suffering is deserved. And the stronger your connection to your group, the easier it becomes to harm those outside it. Not out of malice, but out of moral clarity. You start to believe that mercy for them is cruelty to us. Your brain simplifies. It needs coherence. It can't hold love and contradiction at the same time. So it edits. It tells itself stories. It frames others as corrupt, diseased, subhuman. Not to indulge hatred, but to preserve love. Because to kill and still see the victim as human is unbearable. So the mind strips them of that. It has to. That's how people live with what they've done. That's how they continue loving their families while justifying atrocities. This isn't an anomaly. It's how humans work. It's how moral minds operate when pushed far enough. And it doesn't happen all at once. It starts with a story, a division, a sense of threat, and then a goal, protection, preservation, justice. From there, love becomes armor. It hardens, it excludes. It starts to believe that to show mercy is to betray those you love. And the brain will always choose love over ambiguity. It will always protect its sense of righteousness, even at the cost of others' lives. This is how genocides are made, not just through hate, but through ordinary minds protecting what they care about. It's not sociopathy, it's something deeper, something quieter, a shift so gradual you don't notice it until it's too late. You imagine that you'd never fall into this, that you'd see it coming, that your love would remain pure. But purity is a myth. Love is selective, and when fear enters the picture, love narrows. It defends. It isolates. It makes violence seem noble. This is the contradiction. The better you are at loving your own, the easier it becomes to harm those you believe, threaten them. And the more harm you do, the more your mind justifies it. Because to admit wrongness would mean betraying everything you love. So instead, your brain doubles down. And the deeper this goes, the more irreversible it becomes. You stop seeing others as people. You stop seeing yourself as someone capable of cruelty. And that's when the real damage begins. When love becomes not just a feeling, but a moral weapon. You tell yourself you'd never participate. But if the right story were told, if the right fear were planted, if your group were threatened, what would you justify? How far would you go? Not out of hate, but out of love. Because the truth is, genocide isn't committed by people who forget how to love. It's committed by people who believe love demands it. And the same brain that cries when someone you love is hurt is fully capable of believing that someone else must die because of it. Quietly, logically, without remorse, not because you're a monster, but because your brain, when given the right story, can make almost anything feel like protection. Even mass murder, even genocide, even love. What if you saw someone die and didn't feel anything? Not horror, not sorrow, just a kind of blankness. And worse, what if you weren't alone? What if the people around you also didn't react? Imagine it happens in public. A man collapses on the street. You look around, no one moves. A few people glance over, then look away. One person walks past, scrolling on their phone. Another mutters something under their breath, keeps walking. And you're just standing there. It's not that you don't care, at least you don't think it is, but something stops you. Something holds you in place. A kind of stillness, a quiet consensus that doing nothing is normal. You wait for someone else to take the first step, to break the silence. But no one does, so you don't either. And slowly the discomfort fades. Your heart doesn't race, your hands don't shake. You feel nothing, just a strange calm. You've heard of the bystander effect. You know the psychology. The more people who witness an emergency, the less likely anyone is to help. Everyone waits, everyone hesitates, everyone assumes someone else will act. But knowing the term doesn't protect you from the reality of it. Because in that moment, you're not analyzing, you're not thinking in theories, you're just watching, like everyone else. And the longer the inaction continues, the more normal it becomes. The absence of urgency becomes contagious. You start to feel like the strange one for even questioning it. Why should you be the only one to react? Why should you interrupt the silence? So you don't. You just watch. This isn't about cruelty. It isn't about malice. It's about conformity. About the quiet pull of social cues. When others do nothing, doing nothing feels right. Even if someone is dying. And the most disturbing part is how natural it feels. How easily your emotions adjust. If everyone around you panicked, you'd panic. If they cried, you'd feel sorrow. But if they're calm, detached, then you are too. It's not that the death means less. It's that meaning itself becomes unstable, fluid, shaped by the reactions of others. Now ask yourself this. What if you were the one dying? What if you collapsed on the street, gasping for help, and the people around you just watched? Not out of hatred, not out of indifference, but because no one else was moving. Because silence had already taken hold. Would you understand them? Would you forgive them? Or would it feel like the world had abandoned you? Not deliberately, but passively. That's the horror. Not that people are evil, but that they're neutral. That in the right conditions, your life can end in front of dozens of eyes and mean nothing. You want to believe that if something terrible happened, others would step in, that you'd step in. That compassion is strong enough to break through silence. But the truth is quieter, more uncomfortable. The truth is that most of us wait. We hesitate, we watch. Because emotion isn't just internal, it's social. It mirrors, and when you're surrounded by stillness, your feelings dull, your instincts pause, your conscience fades. You don't even notice it happening. And then it's over. The man on the ground stops moving. Someone finally calls for help. Too late. People start to drift away. The moment ends, and life continues. And you never felt a thing, not because you didn't care, but because no one else did. You wake up, And remember your childhood home. The hallway light, always a little too yellow. The sound of your mother in the kitchen. The way the couch smelled after the sun hit it all afternoon. You're sure these things happened. You're sure they're real, but they might not be. Researchers have already found ways to implant memories in animals while they sleep. Mice taught to fear a sound, even though they never heard it while awake. Just gentle pulses during sleep. That's all it took. Their brains recorded the fear. Their bodies responded to it, as if it had always been real. And now the question becomes simpler. Not whether memories can be changed, but how many already have been. You trust your past because you feel it. You remember it. But memory isn't a recording. It's a reconstruction. Every time you recall something, your brain rebuilds it, alters it, fills in gaps, smooths out contradictions. You never notice, because the illusion is seamless. And in sleep, your defenses are gone. No skepticism, no logic, just pure, unfiltered absorption. If someone whispered the right words, played the right sound, repeated it gently again and again, your brain would take it in. It wouldn't question. It would store it like a truth. Maybe this has already happened. Maybe you already have memories that weren't yours to begin with. Things you feel sure about, an argument you believe happened, a moment of kindness that shaped you, a fear that followed you for years. What if none of it was real? What if your mind just accepted it one night, quietly as you slept? You could say, that wouldn't matter. That even if a memory is false, the emotion is real. But then what are you building your identity on? If who you are is a product of what you've experienced, and your experiences can be fabricated, then what's left? What do you trust? There's a deeper discomfort. Not just that your memories could be changed, but that they could be changed without you ever knowing. That someone could insert guilt, or pride, or shame. They wouldn't have to control your behavior directly. Just tilt your memory slightly. Add a detail here. Remove one there. You'd still make your own choices. You'd still feel autonomous. But the foundation would be altered, and you would never notice. We like to believe our inner lives are protected, that our minds are sealed off from intrusion. But sleep is a door left unlocked, and it doesn't take much. A sound, a voice, a repetition. The brain is so eager to organize, to attach meaning, to make sense of stimuli, even when it's unconscious. And once the memory is in, it behaves like every other one. You might cry over it. You might build your values around it. You might carry it for the rest of your life, never realizing it was given to you by someone else. Think of how easy it would be to shift someone's worldview. You wouldn't need force. You wouldn't need to argue. Just wait for them to sleep, shape their past, reframe their history. Slowly, gently, invisibly. And they'd never resist, because they'd never know. Even more unsettling is how fragile truth becomes under this possibility. If your memory of suffering can be created, then how do you prove what you've endured? If your joy can be implanted, how do you know what's been earned? Everything you use to understand yourself, your fears, your convictions, your beliefs, can be traced back to memories. And now you see that memory is not a mirror. It's a suggestion. A fluid, editable story, and someone else could be the editor. You may think you would notice that something would feel wrong, but memory isn't checked against reality. It's checked against itself. If the new memory fits the pattern of what you already believe, it slides in without friction. No alarm is triggered, you simply adjust. Imagine waking up tomorrow with a vivid memory of a conversation that never happened, a betrayal that never occurred. You'd believe it. You'd act on it. You might confront someone or shut them out, all because your brain silently accepted a lie while you were most vulnerable. The fear isn't just that your past could be rewritten. The fear is that it already has. That parts of who you are, the parts you cling to, defend, define yourself by, were never truly yours, they were installed. And once you see that possibility, you start to wonder how much of your life has been authored by others, not overtly, not cruelly, just subtly, through suggestion, through repetition, through the silence of your own sleep. You still think you're the one in control. But how much of what you are is built on a dream that wasn't yours? A name is supposed to be safe. It's the first sound a child learns to recognize. The first word they understand means them. It's a comfort, an anchor, but it can also be a weapon. What happens when a child learns to fear their own name? Not because of what it means, not because of how it sounds, but because of what always follows it. Imagine this: a child sits quietly on the floor. There's a moment of calm, maybe even happiness. And then they hear it, their name, sharp and sudden, and immediately their stomach tightens, their breathing shifts, their eyes drop. They've learned that sound means something is coming. Not always violence. Sometimes just disapproval. Sometimes anger. Sometimes silence, so cold it hurts more than shouting. But always something. At first, it's just association. Like the way a bell can make a dog salivate. The sound of the name becomes a warning, a signal. Over time, the child flinches before the consequences even arrive. The sound alone is enough. You might think, no, it's not the name they fear. It's the person saying it. But the mind doesn't make that distinction cleanly. The child hears their name hundreds, thousands of times, always in the same context. Eventually, the pattern becomes instinct. The reaction becomes automatic. Now, even in safety, even in peace, the sound of their name can spark anxiety. In school, in friendships, even in love, they hear their name called and feel dread before anything else. Their heart rate rises. They brace themselves, not because they're in danger now, but because they were, once, often enough. And here's where it gets worse. Over time, the name becomes more than a sound. It becomes an identity, a symbol of who they are. If every time they hear it, they expect punishment or rejection, what do they begin to believe about themselves? That they are a problem. That they are a disappointment, that their existence causes disruption. The name becomes proof. It happens slowly, so slowly, no one sees it. The child doesn't even realize. They just become quieter, more cautious. They try harder to please, or they withdraw completely. They start avoiding situations where their name might be called out loud. They don't raise their hand. They don't ask for help. They try not to be noticed, because being noticed always came with a price. Even praise can become confusing. If the same name was used in anger, and now it's used in pride, the child doesn't know what to feel. Is this genuine? Is this safe? Or is it a setup for something else? They stop trusting positive attention, unsure if it will turn against them. The name has no stable meaning anymore, only tension. You might wonder how long this lasts. Surely they outgrow it. Surely with enough love and reassurance, the fear fades. But the brain doesn't forget so easily. The associations formed early, especially those tied to fear, run deep. Even as adults, they can remain, not consciously, always. But in the background, a tightness in the chest when someone says your name sharply, a flush of panic when your name appears in a subject line, a split-second hesitation before answering a call. These aren't personality traits. They're traces of a pattern laid down early, quietly, consistently. And sometimes it turns inward. The person begins to dislike their name. Not for aesthetic reasons, but for emotional ones. It feels heavy, sharp, wrong. It carries weight. They might fantasize about changing it, not to reinvent themselves, but to escape the version of themselves that the name represents. The version they were made to believe they were. You think of identity as something built, something chosen, but often it's inherited, not just genetically or culturally, but emotionally. If your name becomes something you flinch from, what does that do to your sense of self? If the word that means you becomes something you fear, how can you feel whole? And it doesn't take extreme abuse for this to happen. It doesn't take screaming or violence, just repetition, just a consistent pairing of the name with shame, blame, disapproval, just enough to make the sound feel dangerous. Imagine now a teacher calling on a student, using their name. The child freezes, even though they know the answer. They've learned that attention equals threat, or a partner saying their name in a moment of intimacy, and something inside them pulls back, just slightly. A subtle recoil, a crack in the moment. The name triggers something unspoken. This isn't about trauma in the dramatic sense. It's about conditioning. Quiet, unnoticed conditioning that rewires the emotional meaning of a sound. And once that wiring is in place, it shapes everything. Relationships, confidence, self-worth. It's easy to miss, easy to dismiss, but it matters. Because a child can be shaped by things they don't even understand. They can carry fear wrapped in familiarity. They can fear themselves without realizing it. And sometimes the fear doesn't come from what the name brings, but from what it reminds them they are, or what they were told they were. That's the part no one sees. The part that stays quiet until one day someone says their name softly, kindly, and they still flinch. Because even kindness doesn't undo the wiring. It just makes the fear harder to explain. How do you know anything at all? Not in the philosophical sense, not in some abstract debate, but practically, right now. Every second of your life depends on a world you never directly experience. Light touches your eyes, air hits your skin, sound vibrates through your ears, and your brain translates all of it into what you call reality. But that reality isn't the world. It's a version. A filtered, cropped, heavily edited version, optimized not for truth, but for survival. You never see the full spectrum. Your eyes catch just a slice of the light that exists. Your ears hear a narrow band of sound. You don't feel the microscopic world beneath your fingertips. You don't sense electromagnetic fields, or the spin of the earth, or the decay of radioactive atoms. You live inside a carefully limited feed of data, delivered by your senses, then interpreted by a brain built more like a storyteller than a scientist. And yet, you trust it completely. When you see the sun rise, you believe it's the sun moving. You feel the ground beneath your feet and believe the earth is still. You watch a magician pull a coin from thin air and believe for a split second that it really vanished. Your senses lie, constantly, reliably, and your brain fills in the gaps, seamlessly, automatically, without asking. Your brain is not built to perceive truth. It's built to perceive stability, continuity, coherence. It will invent cause where there is none, invent motion, invent identity. It creates a stable, persistent self because that illusion is safer than the chaos of disintegration. You feel like the same person today that you were 10 years ago, but your memories are reconstructed. Your body is different. Even your preferences, your instincts, your reactions, none of them are permanent. Still, you call yourself me, and you never question it. You don't live in the world, you live in a simulation made by your brain. And the simulation is good, so good you never notice it's fake. It only breaks down when reality contradicts your expectations so severely that your brain can't smooth it over. When the world feels wrong in ways you can't explain. That creeping unease when something is off, but you don't know what. That's the moment the illusion cracks. But you rarely get that chance. Most of the time, the illusion holds. You see a face and immediately assign meaning: anger, happiness, threat. You hear a word and assume intention. You feel a breeze and forget to notice that you're not feeling air. You're feeling nerves firing, triggered by pressure. Everything you experience is second-hand, simulated, and you trust it like it's the real thing. Even your thoughts aren't fully yours. They're the end product of 1,000 invisible influences. Your culture, your upbringing, your fears, your biology. You think you believe in justice or fairness or truth, but those are concepts shaped by systems you didn't choose, enforced by feedback loops you don't see. You think you're reasoning, but most of the time you're just rationalizing, explaining after the fact, making sense of choices you made before you even realized you'd made them. And still, you feel certain, confident, assured that your version of reality is correct. But what happens when someone else sees the same thing you do and draws a completely different conclusion? Not because they're lying, not because they're mistaken, but because their simulation is built differently. Different inputs, different edits, different emotional weights attached to different pieces of information. Now you both look at the same world, and you see two different realities, two truths, and both of you are convinced the other must be deluded. You argue, you plead, you show facts, data, evidence, but none of it matters because facts don't exist in isolation. They only exist inside a framework. And when two people have incompatible frameworks, the same evidence leads to opposite beliefs. And if you can't even agree on what's real, how do you find your way back to truth? You start to realize something deeply uncomfortable, that maybe truth isn't something you perceive, it's something you construct. A shared hallucination, stabilized through agreement, but always vulnerable to collapse. Always just one disagreement, away from dissolving. And if that's true, then how can you ever be sure you're right? Not just about politics or philosophy, but about the people you love, the motives you assign, the memories you keep. What if they're all wrong in subtle, invisible ways? What if you're not remembering what happened, but what you wanted to believe happened? And worse, what if every time you recall a memory, you distort it slightly, unknowingly? Science tells us this happens constantly, that the more you remember something, the less accurate it becomes. But you never feel that distortion. You feel certainty, clarity, confidence. You trust your perception, your memory, your judgment. You trust them completely. And maybe that's the real danger. Not that your brain is lying to you, but that it's lying so well, so seamlessly, so persuasively, that you never think to question it. You only see a sliver of reality, and you believe it's the whole. They weren't forced. They volunteered. They signed up, sat down, listened calmly to the instructions. And then they pressed the button. The person on the other side of the wall screamed in pain. They heard it, the clear, immediate. And still, they pressed again, not once or twice, but over and over, increasing the voltage each time, past the point where the screams turned into desperate pleas, past the point where the pleas became silence. They were told to continue, so they did. This wasn't a prison, or a dictatorship, or a battlefield. It was a psychology lab, a clean, quiet building, a man in a white coat, a clipboard, a calm voice that simply said, please continue. And almost all of them did. The subjects weren't monsters. They were ordinary people, students, office workers, parents, people who on any other day might have opened a door for a stranger or helped someone carry groceries. But in this room, all it took was authority, a sense of duty, and the reassurance that someone else was responsible, and they delivered what they believed were fatal shocks to another human being. No threats, no guns, just suggestion. You want to believe you'd be different, that you'd stand up, refuse, walk out. But how can you be sure the subjects were just like you? They didn't see themselves as cruel. They didn't enjoy what they were doing. They hesitated, sweated, questioned. But most of them still followed through. They kept going because they were told to, because they believed someone else would take responsibility. It's easier that way. Responsibility is heavy, but when someone else carries it, an expert, a leader, a system, you feel lighter. And in that lightness, you stop asking whether the thing you're doing is right. You just do it. Even when someone is screaming, even when they might be dying, even when every part of you knows this is wrong, there's a part of your mind that whispers, I have no choice. But you do. You always do. And that's what makes it worse. Because obedience isn't about weakness. It's about survival, fitting in, not being the one who disrupts, who disobeys, who risks being blamed. The urge to conform, to not make waves, is older than civilization itself. We're social creatures. We learn from childhood to listen, to obey, to follow the rules. But rules can be wrong. Authority can lie. And when that happens, obedience becomes a weapon, used against others, used against yourself. The people in that lab didn't stop because the experimenter never told them to. He stayed calm, professional, distant. He gave no orders, only polite instructions. But that was enough, because once you accept someone else's authority, you stop needing reasons. You stop checking your instincts. You stop questioning whether your actions are your own. And then it's not just a button, it's a gun, a drone strike, a law, a policy. And still you say, I'm just doing my job. But that's the point. You don't have to be evil to do harm. You just have to follow the rules. You just have to do what you're told. And this is what makes the experiment so terrifying. Not that a few people went too far, but that most people did. That under the right conditions, obedience becomes more natural than resistance. You want to believe you'd walk away. You want to believe that your sense of morality would overpower pressure, fear, conformity. But most people believe that. And most people were wrong. Because when the voice in the room says continue, something in you wants to comply. You want things to stay simple. You want someone else to be responsible. You want to believe that following orders means you're not to blame, but you are. You always are. And that's the most unsettling part, that morality isn't a shield. It's a burden, that every choice you make belongs to you, especially when you try to give it away. And once you realize that, the question isn't whether you'd press the button. The question is whether, deep down, you're still looking for someone to tell you to. When did you start dying? Not symbolically, not metaphorically, but biologically. Not the kind of death that happens in hospitals with beeping monitors and last breaths. The quieter one. The one that starts before you notice anything wrong, before you feel old, before your body tells you something is changing. It begins in your 20s. Most people don't believe that. You're still young, still strong, still full of energy. But that's the illusion. The peak isn't the beginning, it's the turning point. After that, you're not maintaining, you're declining. Slowly, invisibly. Your brain is already shrinking, not rapidly, just enough. A few neurons here, a few connections there. Memory starts to dull, focus gets a little softer. But you don't notice because it happens beneath the surface, quietly, consistently. A slow erosion of clarity. Your bones are losing density. Not enough to make them brittle yet, but enough to begin. Each year, just a little less strong, a little more fragile. And because it doesn't hurt, because you don't fall apart immediately, you think everything is fine. Your metabolism is slowing. That's why it gets harder to stay in shape. Even if you try, you eat the same, you move the same. But the weight comes on faster now. It's not your willpower. It's biology withdrawing support. Your skin regenerates more slowly. Your muscles recover less efficiently. Your cardiovascular system becomes a little less flexible. Every cell in your body is replicating a little less accurately, a little less often. But none of it feels like dying. It feels like living. That's the trap. You don't feel death creeping in because it doesn't arrive all at once. It leaks in, molecule by molecule. One imperfect cell division, one slight failure of repair, then another, and you adapt. That's what humans do. You get used to it. You forget what it felt like to wake up without pain or without fatigue. You redefine what normal means, lowering the bar each year until your own decline feels invisible. But if you could step back and see yourself over time, not day to day, but decade to decade, you'd see the truth, that you started fading long before you were ready to admit it. Because the first symptoms of aging aren't wrinkles or grey hair. They're hidden, reduced hormone levels, weakened immune response, slower reflexes, all the things you can't see, all the things you won't measure unless someone tells you to. And by the time you feel old, it's not the beginning, it's far past the middle. You live most of your life believing you're climbing, getting stronger, wiser, better. But in many ways, that's only true for a short while. The rest is managing loss, quietly, strategically, often with denial. You start to notice your energy doesn't return like it used to. You stop recovering from illness as quickly. You avoid things that used to be easy, not out of fear, but because your body whispers, not today, and the whisper becomes more frequent. But you don't want to hear it, because if you admit it, you have to confront something terrifying, that your body has always been working against you, that every strength you've ever had was already programmed to disappear, that nothing you do can fully stop it. You can slow it, you can delay it, but you can't undo it, because the machinery is aging too. The very systems designed to maintain you are wearing down. Your body isn't fighting death, it's cooperating with it. And there's no exact moment when it switches sides. It just happens slowly, as repair turns to decay, as resilience turns to vulnerability. People tell themselves they're young at heart, that age is just a number, that it's all about attitude. But attitude can't stop telomeres from shortening. It can't stop mitochondria from degrading. It can't undo entropy. The illusion of youth is powerful, but it's not protection, it's distraction. The truth is, by the time you think of yourself as aging, the process is already well underway. The first decade of your decline is the one where you feel invincible. The damage accumulates long before the consequences appear. You think of death as an event, but it's a gradient, a slow slope you've been sliding down since your mid-20s. The only reason it doesn't feel like dying is because it happens so quietly. You don't fall off a cliff, you sink into the ground. And the most disturbing part is this: you've normalized it. You've accepted the soft fatigue, the slower mornings, the increasing forgetfulness. You think that's just life. But it's not life. It's the slow, quiet echo of death moving through your body, rehearsing. Because your body doesn't wait to feel old before it begins dying. It just waits for you to notice. What if you succeeded and it still wasn't enough? What if every effort you made, every step forward, was quietly sabotaged from inside your own mind? There is a part of your brain that watches you fail and feels satisfied, not surprised, not sad, just quietly affirmed. It doesn't scream. It doesn't try to take over. It simply whispers when you're tired or distracted or vulnerable. It nudges you toward delay. It suggests that one more break, one more indulgence, one more excuse won't matter. And then it steps back and lets you ruin yourself. This isn't your inner critic. It's not anxiety or doubt. It's something deeper, older, something evolutionary, a reflex that formed long before you understood what you wanted from life. It evolved to protect you, to conserve energy, avoid risk, preserve social acceptance. In an environment where ambition could be fatal, hesitation kept you alive. That part of you still believes it's helping. But now it's wrong, and it's still in control. You sit down to begin, and it tells you to wait. You make progress, and it tells you to stop. You imagine the future you want, and it quietly reminds you of how often you failed before. It never argues. It just waits for your energy to dip, then steps in and fills the silence with something easier. It feels like you, but it's not. It's a script. An ancient loop, repeating itself in a brain that hasn't adapted to the world you now live in. You punish yourself for procrastinating, for avoiding, for giving in, but you're not lazy, you're not weak. You're following instructions, old ones, deep ones. Instructions wired into you long before you ever had goals of your own. And here's the disturbing part. This system isn't broken. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do. Every delay, every escape, every act of self-sabotage, it's your brain succeeding at a task you never consciously agreed to. You think you're resisting success, but really you're obeying an older form of survival. This part of your brain doesn't care if you're fulfilled. It doesn't care if you reach your potential. It cares if you stay safe, familiar, predictable. It rewards sameness. It punishes deviation, and it's always faster than your conscious thought. By the time you notice yourself hesitating, it's already done. The decision has already been made. You're just catching up to it. And when you fail, it doesn't feel disappointed. It feels relief, because success brings change. Change brings threat, and your oldest reflex is to avoid threat at any cost, even the cost of your dreams. So you sabotage, you delay, you shrink, and you tell yourself you're doing it because of fear or laziness or lack of motivation. But those are just symptoms. The cause is older, quieter, built into you. Even worse, it learns every time you give in. It adapts. It becomes harder to notice, easier to justify. Its voice becomes your voice. Its values become your values. You stop questioning it. You start calling it me. And then, one day you wake up and realize that most of your life has been built, not by your desires, but by your avoidance. That your goals were shaped more by fear than by vision. That your habits were sculpted by a part of you that doesn't want you to grow. And that part is still here, still watching, still whispering. Not because it hates you, not because it wants to ruin you, but because a very long time ago, survival meant staying exactly where you are. And in some quiet corner of your brain, that's still the goal. What if you found yourself doing something wrong, but you didn't choose it? Imagine an identical twin, raised in a different city, by different parents, with a different childhood, and yet somehow they grow up just like you. Not just in the ways you expect. Same food preferences, same posture, same laugh, but also the same dark impulses, the same private cruelty, the same unspoken addictions. You steal something small, so do they. You lie when it's convenient, so do they. You cheat, manipulate, control, and they do too. Not because anyone taught them to, but because something inside them just tilted that way. And now you wonder, who are you, really? If someone else far away, with none of your memories, makes the same mistakes you do, is that still your fault? If your worst tendencies can be mirrored perfectly by a stranger with your face, can you still call them choices? Can you claim moral ownership over what feels more and more like fate? People like to believe in agency, in willpower, in free choice. But studies of identical twins, separated at birth, raised in isolation, keep finding something else. Strange parallels, shared preferences, shared fears, even shared vices. Patterns so consistent, it stops feeling like coincidence. Some develop the same obsessive routines. Some exhibit identical compulsions. Some fall into identical self-destruction, across distance, without influence, as if their lives were following a script they never wrote. And once you see that, something shifts. You stop asking, what kind of person am I? And you start asking, was there ever any other kind of person I could have been? Because maybe the version of you that doesn't lie, that doesn't sabotage relationships, that doesn't spiral into addiction or resentment or cruelty, maybe that version never existed, not in any meaningful way. Maybe the version you are was always going to emerge, under different names, in different cities, at different times, but always the same. That thought is hard to hold. It presses against everything we're told about accountability, about growth, about change. You want to believe your darker habits are mistakes, products of your environment, your upbringing, your pain. But what if they're not? What if there's something deeper, older, hardwired? What if they're the closest thing to a true self you've ever had? You start thinking back to your worst moments, the times you hurt people, the times you sabotaged something good, and you wonder if your twin did the same, without knowing you at all. Then what does that mean for regret? Is regret still noble, still transformative, if it was never optional, or does it become something else? A kind of performance, a way of coping with a fate you are always going to fulfill. Not remorse, just resignation. And then you wonder how many of your other traits are like this too. Not just the dark ones, but the quiet ones, the preferences, the fears, the patterns you never questioned. What if none of those were earned, either? What if they were just revealed, slowly, as your life unfolded? Like reading a story that had already been written, line by line, thinking you were choosing the words. There's a comfort in thinking we are authors of our lives, that our character is something we build. But identical twins raised apart don't always tell that story. Sometimes they tell a different one where you're not writing the story, you're just discovering it. And that raises a quieter, deeper fear. Because if the worst parts of you aren't really yours, then the best parts aren't either. Your kindness, your patience, your loyalty. Maybe those aren't moral achievements. Maybe they're just reflexes, pre-written, like the rest. And if that's true, if you are always going to be who you are, then what does it mean to change? What does it mean to improve? What does it mean to be responsible? What does it mean to be free? Maybe you still believe you have answers, but if somewhere out there, another version of you is making the same mistakes at the same time for the same reasons, then maybe you're not asking the right questions. And maybe that's the most disturbing part, that the voice asking those questions right now might not be yours at all. You trust your instincts. You say things like, I just had a gut feeling, as if that explains everything. And maybe it does. Because what your gut tells you feels real, immediate, convincing, often more persuasive than facts or logic ever could be. But what if it's not truth you're hearing? What if that gut feeling is just the fastest lie your brain can create? You don't think of it as lying. You think of it as intuition, survival, wisdom. You imagine a deep, subconscious part of you working in the background, making quick, complex judgments that your conscious mind couldn't possibly keep up with. And maybe that's partially true. But speed comes with shortcuts, and shortcuts are where truth gets lost. You feel an instant dislike for someone. You tell yourself it's instinct, that you just know something's off. But later you realize they reminded you of someone else. Or they said something that triggered an old, unrelated memory. And by then your gut has already decided. Your brain doesn't revisit the evidence. It rationalizes the conclusion. It builds a story to protect the feeling. You trust your first impressions, your snap decisions, your subtle discomfort. You say you're good at reading people. But how often is that confidence just a polished excuse for prejudice, fear, or emotional noise you don't understand? You don't know because your brain protects the lie before you even notice it started. And it's not just other people. You make fast decisions about yourself too. You decide you're not good enough. You decide you're not ready. You decide something will never work before you've tried, before you've questioned, before you've looked closely. And then you move forward as if those decisions were facts. You avoid opportunities, end relationships, give up early, not because of what's real, but because of what your gut whispered in a moment of fear. You want to believe your instincts are honest, but honesty takes time, and your gut doesn't wait. It leaps to conclusions, then dares your conscious mind to challenge them. And most of the time, you don't. You want to move forward. You want to feel certain, so you accept the lie, even when it leads you somewhere harmful, even when it closes you off from people, from truth, from growth, because the lie feels safer than the discomfort of not knowing. And this is where it gets darker, because your gut doesn't just lie to protect you. Sometimes it lies to control you. It tells you what to believe, who to trust, what to fear. It turns your preferences into judgments, your anxieties into certainties, your insecurities into convictions. It makes the lie feel like clarity, and clarity is seductive. It ends the conflict before it begins. You don't need to weigh evidence, consider alternatives, or sit with doubt. You just know. And when you just know, you stop looking. You stop learning. You stop questioning. That's the real danger. Not the lie itself, but how quickly you become loyal to it. You defend it, repeat it, act on it. Not because it's right, but because it feels true. And feeling true is enough. So you make choices, big ones, life-changing ones. All because of something that emerged in less than a second, before you had time to think, to analyze, to wonder. And once the choice is made, your brain does the rest. It fills in the gaps. It smooths out the inconsistencies. It rewrites history, so the lie becomes the story. You don't even notice it happening. That's how effective the process is. That's how skilled your mind is at turning split-second instinct into settled belief. You think you're acting on truth, but you're not. You're acting on the fastest explanation your brain could invent, and then refusing to let it go. And maybe the worst part is that sometimes it works. Sometimes the lie gets you through the moment. Sometimes it protects you, motivates you, even helps you succeed. But even then, it leaves a trace, a pattern, a habit of trusting the fast story instead of facing the hard one. Over time, the lie becomes the default, not because it's accurate, but because it's easy. And now, when something feels off, you don't ask why, you don't pause, you don't wonder, you just act and call it instinct. Call it wisdom, call it your gut. But underneath that confidence, something is missing. Not logic, not data, not experience. What's missing is the willingness to say, I don't know. Because once you say that, the lie starts to fall apart. And when the lie falls apart, so does the illusion of certainty. And without certainty, you're vulnerable again, exposed. But maybe that's what truth feels like. Not clarity, not confidence. Just a quiet, uneasy willingness to admit you might be wrong. Are you sure you're not hallucinating right now? It sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? You're awake, you're functioning, you're moving through your day with clarity. But how would you know, really know, that every part of your experience is real? That every face you see, every word you hear, every memory you recall is genuinely happening the way you believe? Your confidence comes from consistency. Things look the same, feel the same, behave the same. You trust your perceptions because they've always worked before. But what if that trust is misplaced? What if some parts of your life, small ones, unimportant ones, are fabrications? Hallucinations so precise, so consistent, that you'd never even think to question them. You assume hallucinations are loud, disruptive, chaotic. But many aren't. Some are quiet, seamless, designed by your own brain to maintain a sense of order, a person you pass in the hallway, a voice you think you heard, a detail on a sign, a fleeting sensation. They come and go, unnoticed, folded perfectly into the rest of your reality. Most people don't realize this, but the brain hallucinates all the time. Vision isn't raw data, it's interpretation. Your eyes take in fragmented, incomplete information. Your brain fills in the blanks. What you think you see is partly real, partly guessed. That's not a flaw. It's how you function. But it also means that parts of your life, the edges, the gaps, are constructed, invented. And sometimes your brain invents more than just the edges. Sometimes it creates entire events. Conversations that never happened. Memories built from suggestion. Emotional reactions to things you imagined. Not because you're sick or broken, but because the brain is a prediction machine, and sometimes its guesses are wrong. You've probably experienced this already. You think you sent a message, but never did. You recall placing something somewhere, only to find it in a different room. You swear someone said something, but they deny it. You brush these off as forgetfulness, distractions, miscommunication. But what if some of them weren't errors in memory, but in perception itself? What if you hallucinated them? It's easy to reject this idea because it feels threatening. You want to believe your thoughts reflect reality, but they don't always. And the scariest part is that when they don't, you usually can't tell. There's no internal alarm, no warning. The hallucination feels just as solid, just as real as everything else. And it's not just about vision or hearing. Your sense of time, your emotional state, your beliefs about what's happening, these can all be influenced by subconscious inferences. Your brain creates a version of the world that it thinks is most likely. But it doesn't always check whether it's true. It just feels true. You might believe you're remembering yesterday, clearly. But memories are reconstructed each time you recall them. They aren't pulled from a file, they're rebuilt from fragments. Which means every memory is vulnerable to distortion or fabrication. A false memory can feel more vivid than a real one. You'd swear it happened, swear it mattered, even if it never occurred. And now you have to ask yourself something more uncomfortable. If your mind can invent details, events, even people, how much of your life is real? Not just in theory, but right now. What parts of today never happened the way you think they did? What conversations were misheard? What faces were imagined? What if someone you spoke to didn't exist? Not because of a malfunction, but because your brain wanted things to make sense. It needed continuity. It needed a narrative, so it created one. And if that's true, if your brain can create convincing hallucinations without you knowing, how do you separate real from unreal? You might say, it doesn't matter if I can't tell, but it does. Because it means your beliefs, your emotions, your reactions may be based on things that never happened. You might resent someone for something they never said. You might feel loved because of a kindness no one offered. You might trust someone based on an illusion, or fear them because of a lie. Your mind whispered quietly into your experience, and you'd never know. You'd keep going, stacking more beliefs on top of those false ones, building an entire view of the world that rests on hallucinated foundations. Bit by bit, your reality bends, not because of some grand delusion, but because of 1,000 tiny, unnoticed errors. And once you start to see that, you begin to lose something. Not your sanity, something quieter. Your certainty. Your ability to trust the obvious. You begin to wonder. Cautiously, if some things you've believed for years were never real, if some arguments were imagined, if some of your guilt is misplaced, or worse, if some of your peace is too, maybe someone you've hated didn't deserve it. Maybe someone you miss never existed. The way you remember, maybe the moment you've built your identity around wasn't real, and you'll never be able to check. There's no recording, no objective replay, just your mind, offering what it thinks happened, as it always does, as it always will. So now you're left in a strange place. You still see the world, still move through it, but something has changed. A quiet uncertainty, always there, whispering, what if this part is fake? What if this is one of the ones you'll never notice? And that uncertainty doesn't go away. Because the most disturbing part isn't that you could be hallucinating, it's that you already are. Would a brain in a jar know that it's happy? You picture it suspended in fluid, connected by wires to machines it can't see, delivering pulses it doesn't understand. It has no eyes, no body, no memories of ever moving. Just signals, stimulating the precise regions responsible for pleasure, satisfaction, calm. And it's enough. It feels content, not because it knows what contentment is, but because the sensation is there. The chemical patterns match. The data aligns, and in the dark silence of its existence, that sensation, however synthetic, is all it has. You might want to say it doesn't count, that this isn't real happiness, but the brain wouldn't know the difference. It was never taught to compare. It doesn't ask where the signals come from or whether they're natural. It can't question what it was never given the tools to question. So, is that happiness? You still want to say no, because it offends something in you. The idea that pure, isolated experience, without meaning, memory, or choice, could be called joy. It feels hollow, but maybe that's just because you're used to thinking of happiness as earned, as something you strive for, fight for, something that must come after struggle. But what if that's just cultural conditioning? What if happiness never needed a story? What if it's just a chemical state, blindly achieved? This brain, cut off from everything you consider human, might be more consistently happy than anyone you know. No grief, no fear, no longing, no doubt. It floats in quiet stimulation, untroubled by unmet expectations. Perfectly still, perfectly stable, experiencing nothing but the signals we call pleasure. But now imagine this. What if the brain had once been attached to a person? What if it remembers the world, remembers love, touch, time? What if it recognizes that these sensations are artificial, that the joy it feels is hollow, designed, imposed? Would it still feel happy? The signals would still reach the same neurons. The chemicals would still flood the same pathways. But the awareness of the lie would sit underneath it all, a constant pressure just beneath the pleasure. Could that awareness cancel out the feeling? Could truth poison happiness? Now you start to see the problem differently. It isn't about whether the brain can feel happy. It's about whether that happiness means anything. Once you know it was engineered, and that brings you uncomfortably close to your own life. You think you're free. You think your happiness comes from meaning, relationships, purpose. But your brain, like the one in the jar, only responds to signals. Your sense of joy, connection, fulfillment, they're all reactions. And those reactions can be triggered by things that aren't true. Flattery, manipulation, delusion. Even lies you tell yourself because the alternative feels unbearable. And if your happiness comes from those things, is it really any different? You want to believe you're better off, that your joy is deeper because it comes with context. But maybe context just makes the illusion more convincing. Maybe your brain is already halfway in the jar, responding to stories, images, distractions you didn't choose, but still believe. Maybe the only real difference is that the jar makes it obvious, because you want happiness to be more than this. You want it to come from love, from growth, from truth. But what if those are just categories your brain learned to associate with safety and reward? What if all your joy is just the result of stimulation, like the brain in the jar, only less efficient? And now the question changes. Not can a brain in a jar feel happiness, but can you? Can anyone? If happiness is just the right chemical balance, does it matter where it comes from? You want to say yes. You want to insist that authenticity matters. That joy should be earned, should reflect something real, but you can't explain why. You can't point to anything in your own brain that proves your happiness is more valid than the one floating in fluid. You just feel it. And maybe that's the most unsettling part, that even the feeling that your joy is real might not be. It might just be another signal, another trick, and the brain in the jar might be the only one, not pretending. Would you trust someone more just because they're visibly broken? You see a face, lined, scarred, asymmetrical. It shouldn't feel comforting. But something inside you softens. You don't recoil. You lean in. You trust them, somehow, more than the perfect ones. You don't notice yourself doing it. But you are, and it's happening all the time. It starts with instinct. You don't think about it. You just feel it. A scar on the cheek, a misshapen nose, an old burn faded into the skin. These things trigger something ancient, not pity. Not fear, something quieter, something closer to belief. You think they've been through something, and you trust people who've been through things. But why? Is it because pain leaves marks, and we're drawn to pain we can see? Is it because visible flaws feel like proof that they've lived, suffered, endured? Maybe, or maybe it's something uglier. Maybe perfect faces feel manipulative. Too smooth, too controlled, too easy to fake. A flawless face could be lying to you, hiding something, concealing its history. But a scar doesn't lie. We think of honesty as vulnerability. So when you see someone marked, you tell yourself they have nothing to hide. You assign them sincerity without knowing them. And that's the trap, because the scar doesn't tell you anything about the person. It doesn't tell you what they did. It doesn't tell you what they're capable of. It only tells you that something happened to them, that they didn't come out untouched. And we confuse that with truth. The dangerous part is, this isn't a conscious decision. You don't weigh the logic of it. You just feel it. You meet two strangers, one flawless, the other visibly damaged, and some part of you begins to whisper, softly, that the damaged one is more real, more authentic, more safe. But none of that is guaranteed. A scarred face can lie just as easily as a smooth one. A weathered face can hide just as much cruelty, as much deceit. You know this. And still, the feeling remains. You assume the scarred person has suffered. That suffering made them humble. That humility made them good. But these are just associations, not facts. They're stories your mind tells to make sense of discomfort. And you believe the stories, even when they're wrong. There's something else, something colder. The perfect face reminds you of what you're not. It triggers insecurity, envy, distance. But a scarred face gives you permission. Permission to relax, permission to be flawed. You don't have to compete with them. You don't have to perform. And so you feel safer. But safety isn't the same as trust. And comfort isn't the same as truth. You tell yourself you're not superficial, that you look past appearances. But you're not looking past them. You're looking through them, reading them like a map, projecting morality, character, trustworthiness, based on things that have nothing to do with who the person is. This makes you vulnerable, not to harm, necessarily, but to misjudgment. You might dismiss someone too beautiful as fake, shallow, dishonest. You might trust someone too quickly because they look damaged, not because you know them, but because your instincts trick you into thinking you do. And here's the deeper discomfort. Maybe you're doing this because you want to be seen the same way. Maybe you crave visible wounds because your invisible ones feel dismissed. Maybe you envy the honesty others assign to the scarred because your pain doesn't show. You want your suffering to be legible too. So you project authenticity onto others, hoping to receive it in return. It's not about faces, it's about signals. About finding reasons to believe someone is real. About needing to believe someone is real. In a world full of filters and pretenses and surfaces, you're desperate for something that feels unfiltered, unperformed. You see a scar and think, they didn't choose that. They didn't edit that. It must be true. But honesty isn't visible. Pain isn't always printed on skin. And trust shouldn't be automatic. Yet here you are, building quiet hierarchies of belief based on facial asymmetry and surface imperfection. Not because it feels right, and feelings, as always, are not truth. So what does that mean about you? It means your judgments are flawed. It means your instincts are shaped by evolution, emotion, projection. It means you are constantly mistaking signal for substance. And most of all, it means you are not as rational, not as fair, not as perceptive as you believe. The scar doesn't make them honest. You do, by wanting them to be. How long was the last hour of your life? Not in minutes, not by the clock. How long did it feel? Because it wasn't really 60 minutes. Was it? It might have felt like 5 or 50 or none at all. And now the question becomes harder. How do you know how much time has passed when your body doesn't track it in numbers, but in feeling? You think of time as fixed, measured, scientific, absolute. But the more closely you look at it, the more it slips through your fingers. Time bends, not just in physics, but in you. Think of the longest moment you've ever lived. Maybe it was 5 seconds before hearing something you couldn't take back. A pause in a phone call, a breath before an accident. Just a few heartbeats, but it expanded, stretched. It became a room you were locked inside, a chamber echoing with the future. And now remember a time it vanished. A vacation maybe. An entire day of joy, of ease, and you blinked, and it was gone. You remember that it happened, but you don't remember feeling it happen. Time compressed itself. slipped away like it didn't want to be noticed. Physics can explain this in part. How gravity and velocity stretch or contract time. But that isn't what you're experiencing. You're not near a black hole. You're not traveling at the speed of light. You're sitting at your desk, lying in bed, standing in line. And still time bends, it betrays its own laws, and you are the one distorting it. Because emotion bends time, more than motion ever could. Pain makes it slow, dread makes it infinite, joy makes it vanish. Boredom stretches it thin, while panic thickens it until you can't breathe. You can live 1,000 years in a minute, or you can live nothing at all in an hour. And that's the trap. You can't trust time as you feel it, and yet you have no access to it any other way. So you start to measure your life not by what happened, but by how it felt. And you realize some months have passed without existing at all, and some single moments echo forever. This means your life isn't made of time. It's made of emotion wearing the mask of time. Experience shapes duration. Intensity writes your clock. You age in emotion, not in hours, which leads to something more unsettling. If time is made of feeling, then suffering literally makes life longer. The more you hurt, the more you live, and peace, by contrast, becomes ephemeral, untraceable. The good moments shrink away, they're barely there. You remember they happened, but not how they felt. What does that mean for how you spend your time? If joy evaporates while pain expands, then pleasure gives you less life than misery does. If you want to feel time, truly feel it, you have to suffer, you have to wait, to ache, to fear. And if you want life to pass, you chase happiness, because happiness is the fastest way through time. So now you're stuck. If you live in comfort, you feel less of your life. But if you want to feel every second, you must suffer. There's no middle ground. Not really. And here's the quiet horror. Your brain wasn't built to track time. It was built to survive it. And survival doesn't want you to feel too much joy, because then you'll stop watching. It doesn't want you to feel too much pain, because then you'll break. So it bends time constantly to keep you alert, numb, hopeful, or afraid. You are never living in time as it is, only as your body thinks it should feel. That means memory is a distortion. Regret is a distortion. Grief stretches time backward. Anxiety stretches it forward. Even right now, as you listen to this, your sense of the present is being edited in real time by your own mind. So if time is perception, and perception is emotion, and emotion is unstable, then what is time? You can measure it on your phone, but you can't live it there. You can count it, but never hold it. You can plan for it, but never step inside it until it's already passing you by. And maybe that's the most disturbing part. Not that time can be distorted, but that your entire life is being shaped by an illusion that feels real only because your brain wants it to. You're not moving through time. Time is moving through you. Warped, colored, sculpted by everything you feel but can't control. And if emotion stops, if you ever truly go numb, time stops with it. So when you say you want more time, be careful. You might not be asking for life. You might just be asking for more feeling, more suffering, more dread, more moments stretched into hours, not because they were long, but because they hurt. And maybe that's what time really is. A record of how much pain you've survived. Imagine someone wrongs you publicly, viciously. They hurt someone you love, mock you, damage your life in a way that feels deliberate. Months pass, maybe even years. One day you see them again. They've forgotten. They smile like nothing ever happened, but you haven't. You remember everything. Would you feel justified in doing something about it? Now, imagine you're not a person. You're a crow. There's no dramatic music, no swelling anger, just stillness, recognition. An imprint burned so deeply into your perception that it will never go away. A face that did something to you. A shape that carries meaning. And unlike most animals, you remember, not just the action, but the face behind it. Crows don't forget. They've been studied, observed, tested. Scientists who wore masks while threatening or harming crows found themselves recognized years later by crows who had never seen them before. The knowledge had been passed down, face to face, generation to generation. A memory carried not just through one mind, but through a community. A culture of resentment. That word is important. Culture. It means crows don't just remember, they share, they teach. They hold on to the faces that caused harm and make sure others know too, and they act. They retaliate, not blindly, but surgically. They single you out. They warn others. They track you. What does that mean for how we think about revenge? We're taught to believe vengeance is human, complex. That holding a grudge requires introspection, emotional depth, some level of sophistication. But a crow, with no spoken language, no courts, no written laws, still understands the moral weight of harm, still remembers who did what, and still refuses to let it go. This isn't about justice, it's about memory with teeth. You can't reason with a crow. You can't explain your side of the story. Once your face is marked, it stays marked. You carry the weight of what you did, regardless of your intent, regardless of your regret. And even if you change, it doesn't matter. The version of you that harmed them still exists, in their mind, in their warnings, in their watchfulness. You don't get to outgrow your mistakes. You don't get to move on, and they don't stop watching. Some crows have been known to follow people for years, quietly, patiently, not attacking, not forgetting, just waiting, in the trees, on the wires, close enough to see, far enough to vanish. A surveillance you'll never fully detect, never completely escape, not for punishment, just to make sure you never feel safe again. So you begin to wonder, how different are you, really? You tell yourself you forgive, you let things go, but deep inside, don't you carry faces too? People who humiliated you, betrayed you, left scars you never talk about. You don't think about them every day. But when you see their face again, even for a moment, it all comes back. The feeling in your body, the shift in your breathing, recognition laced with tension, an emotional memory so precise, it bypasses thought. You don't need to remember the details. Your body does that for you. You're more like the crow than you'd like to admit. And if you had the chance, would you warn others, quietly, subtly, just enough to protect them from someone you know can't be trusted? Would you pass down the story, not with anger, but with caution, not to harm, but to prepare? Would your memory become a kind of quiet legacy, shaping how others see someone without them ever knowing why? And then, one step further, what if someone remembers you? What if, long ago, in some moment you forgot, you did something careless, something cruel? Maybe you thought it was justified. Maybe you didn't think about it at all. But someone did, and now, years later, they remember your face the way a crow does, with purpose, with clarity, with consequence. Would you even recognize them? Would you know the moment was coming? Or would it arrive like a shadow, an act, a silence you never saw building? This is the disturbing part. Not that crows remember, but that their memory mirrors ours and makes us confront the possibility that we're not as forgiven or forgotten as we pretend to be. Somewhere, someone might still remember your face, and they haven't let it go. Your legs aren't broken. Your skin isn't bleeding. Your bones aren't fractured. But you're in pain, real pain. sharp, burning, unbearable, and no one can see it. The MRI scan shows nothing. Your blood work is normal. Every test says you're fine, but you're not. You're limping, flinching, sweating. Your body responds like it's wounded, like it's under attack. But there's nothing wrong, at least, nothing anyone else can find. You start to wonder if you're imagining it, if you're weak, if you've lost control. But the truth is worse than that. The pain is real. It's just coming from your brain. Your brain has the power to simulate pain so vividly, so completely, that your body behaves as if it's injured. Muscles tense. Inflammation spreads. Nerves misfire. Your system floods with stress hormones, pulling resources from your immune system, from digestion, from healing. You don't have a wound, but you begin to deteriorate as if you do. And still, no one believes you. The absence of physical damage becomes evidence against your suffering. People assume you're exaggerating, seeking attention, avoiding responsibility. Even doctors hesitate, unsure how to help when there's no injury to treat. So you start to doubt yourself, but your body doesn't. It spirals. The pain gets worse. It spreads. Your sleep disappears. Your energy collapses. Your thoughts grow dark. What began as a signal, a warning, has become a loop. Pain feeding pain, fear feeding fear. And every time you hope it will pass, your brain tightens its grip. You learn eventually that pain isn't a signal of injury. It's a prediction. Your brain guesses what's happening, fills in the gaps. And if it expects pain strongly enough, it doesn't need evidence, it creates it. The more you've experienced pain in the past, the more easily your brain anticipates it. And the more it anticipates it, the more it delivers. This isn't rare. It's not a medical curiosity. It's called central sensitization, and it affects millions. Some people develop it after surgery, others after trauma, some after emotional stress. Their nervous systems become so primed for pain that even light touches, sounds, or thoughts can trigger agony. And the longer it lasts, the harder it is to unwind. You might think pain is just a sensation, like heat or pressure, but it's not. It's a decision. Your brain decides whether you should feel it, how much you should feel, and for how long. That decision is influenced by everything: your memories, your mood, your beliefs, your fears. If you believe you're in danger, the pain intensifies. If you feel safe, it might lessen. Not because your body has changed, but because your brain has re-evaluated the threat. Now imagine living in a constant state of perceived threat. Your job, your relationships, your future, all uncertain, overwhelming. Your body isn't safe, but it's not injured either. Still, your brain responds as if you've been hurt. It simulates pain to protect you, but the protection becomes the problem. This is why chronic pain doesn't behave like normal pain. It doesn't match the injury. It doesn't heal with time. It doesn't respond to rest. Because the pain isn't coming from the body. It's coming from a prediction that never turns off. But there's something even more disturbing. Pain doesn't just simulate injury. It can cause it. Over time, chronic pain reshapes your brain. It weakens areas responsible for focus and memory. It strengthens regions that produce fear. It suppresses healing hormones and damages immune function. It even accelerates aging at the cellular level. You began with no injury, but now your body is deteriorating. Not from trauma, but from perception, from expectation, from pain that was never real, yet became real anyway. There are people who wake up every day in agony because of something their brain decided years ago. A fall, a breakup, a failed surgery. Their nervous systems were overwhelmed and never recalibrated. Their bodies are sound, but their lives are wrecked. And this isn't just about chronic pain. The same mechanisms apply to anxiety, fatigue, nausea. Your brain simulates what it expects. If it expects threat, it produces the sensations of threat, not to punish you, but to protect you, to keep you still, to keep you safe. But when the signal never ends, the protection becomes a prison. You might assume your body is separate from your thoughts, that your brain is rational, mechanical, objective. But it's not. It's reactive, predictive, shaped by experience and emotion. And once it learns to expect suffering, it becomes very, very good at creating it. Now imagine trying to escape that, trying to convince your brain that the danger is over, that you're safe, that it doesn't need to keep hurting you. But the pain itself makes safety feel impossible. And so the cycle continues. You wake up each day to a body screaming from wounds that don't exist. You carry the burden of invisible suffering, and no one sees it. No one believes it. No one understands that your brain has become your tormentor, and it won't stop until it unlearns the very thing it created to protect you. And maybe it never will. Would it feel different to kill someone if you knew they weren't real? You're in a virtual world. Every detail is lifelike. The faces are expressive, the voices convincing, the pain looks indistinguishable from the real thing. You know it's a simulation. These people don't exist, not in any biological sense, but their reactions are believable. They plead, they scream, they beg, and you pull the trigger anyway. In real life, most people would hesitate. They would freeze up, shake, feel sick. Even if the killing was justified, self-defense, revenge, mercy, it would still leave something behind. A weight, a stain, something you carry with you. But in VR, that weight fades. There's no body, no aftermath, no permanent consequence, just a reset button. So you try again. Another life, another kill, and slowly it gets easier. The ethical rules you thought were unshakable begin to bend, not because your beliefs change, but because the cost of breaking them disappears. Morality becomes elastic when there's no real suffering, when no one can truly be hurt, when you're the only person who exists. You start to notice something else too. In VR, you're not afraid of guilt. You're not afraid of being caught. You're not even afraid of being wrong. You're free to test your limits, to act out impulses you'd never admit to having. Not because you're evil, not because you're violent, but because the environment gives you permission to stop pretending. You realize how much of your so-called morality depends on pressure, on risk, on consequences. Without those, your actions follow different rules. And then something stranger happens. You start to justify it. You begin to convince yourself that this simulated person isn't just fake, but less than fake, less than a character in a story. Just pixels, just patterns, just programming. You disconnect, dehumanize. You tell yourself there's no self to harm here, no soul, no real mind. But if that's true, why does it still feel like something? Maybe it's because the reactions are too convincing. Maybe it's because your brain can't fully distinguish real from simulated when the illusion is good enough. Or maybe it's because the person you're harming on some level is still you. Because the part of you doing the killing is real. Your choices are real. The pathway your mind takes to make those decisions, that's the part that matters. Not what happens on the screen, but what happens inside you. And here's where it turns. Because if you're willing to do it in VR, without hesitation, without discomfort, what does that say about who you are outside of it? You might say, it's just a game, it's not real. But that phrase reveals more than it hides. You're admitting something quietly, that your morality only applies when there are real stakes. But what does real mean? in a world where simulations feel indistinguishable from life? What happens when virtual suffering becomes emotionally convincing, even if it's logically empty? How long before your emotional responses start to shift? How long before you no longer feel anything, even when the suffering looks just like the real thing? And what if this isn't just about you? What if entire generations grow up learning that empathy is optional, that pain without consequence isn't pain at all, that harm only counts if it's visible, measurable, permanent? What happens when morality becomes conditional, based not on the act, but on whether someone is watching? You tell yourself you'd never hurt someone in real life, that your actions in VR don't reflect who you are. But how can you be sure? What if the only reason you haven't crossed the line is because the world hasn't made it easy enough yet? You start to understand that the boundaries of your ethics aren't defined by compassion. They're defined by context, by threat, by social pressure. And once those disappear, you don't become your best self. You become your freest self. And that self might be capable of things you never expected. So maybe it's true. Maybe you'd kill more ethically in VR than in real life. Because in VR, you're not afraid. Because in VR, ethics become convenience. Because in VR, nothing stops you but yourself. And maybe that's the most disturbing part. The idea that without real-world limits, morality doesn't get stronger, it dissolves, quietly, completely. Until the person you thought you were becomes someone you don't even recognize. Not evil. Not monstrous, just free and empty and unafraid. You're sitting alone, and for no reason at all, you force yourself to smile. Just a slight curl of the lips, nothing more. There's no joy behind it, no moment of happiness. You're not amused, not entertained, not even pretending for someone else. You're doing it deliberately, mechanically, and yet something shifts, not dramatically, not enough to make you laugh or forget your problems. But there's a tension that loosens, a heaviness that softens, as if your body doesn't entirely know the difference between fake and real, as if emotion can be tricked into existence by behavior alone. That idea should feel empowering, but instead it's unnerving. Because it means your feelings aren't as solid or truthful as you thought. It means happiness might not be the result of a deep internal truth, but a surface-level illusion that your mind is willing to believe. You've always assumed that emotions come first, that what you feel shapes what you do. But what if that order is reversed? What if the way you hold your face, the way you move your body, the way you speak, what if those things create the feeling, not just express it? You think of yourself as someone with integrity, honest with your emotions. But maybe that's not what's happening. Maybe your emotions are just responses, reactions to your posture, your environment, your breath. Maybe sadness doesn't emerge from within, but seeps in from outside, collecting in the silence between your actions. You start to notice it in other places. You walk with your shoulders low and feel more tired. You sit in silence too long and begin to feel alone. You mimic confidence for someone else's sake, and your own fear lessens, not because it disappeared, but because the act of pretending has started to shape your reality. This isn't about manipulation or self-deception. It's about how fragile the boundary is between what's real and what's performed. If faking a smile can lift your mood, even slightly, then what does that say about the rest of your feelings? How much of what you call truth is just momentum? It becomes hard to trust yourself. You remember a time you cried, but only after someone asked if you were okay. Were you already sad, or did the act of being asked, of being seen, push you into sadness? You remember laughing at a joke that wasn't funny, but the smile felt good, so you let it stay. Did the feeling follow the act, or was it always there, waiting to be confirmed? You realize there's no clean answer, that your body is constantly feeding your mind stories about how to feel, and your mind believes them, often without question. This doesn't make your feelings fake, but it makes them malleable, vulnerable, not sacred, not pure, just flexible responses, shaped by things you don't notice. That's the disturbing part. You want your emotions to mean something. You want to believe they reveal something true about you. But what if they're just responses to the script your body performs? What if you're less of a consistent self and more of a fluctuating system? One that adapts, conforms, and reshapes itself according to context. You begin to wonder if you smile enough times, even when nothing feels good. Could you slowly reshape the person you are? Could you become happy by pretending to be happy long enough? And if so, does that make your happiness fake? Or worse, was your sadness ever real? You think back on years of moods, of beliefs you held about yourself. You told people you were anxious, or melancholic, or calm. But how much of that identity was created by the way you carried yourself? How much of it was reinforced by repeated expressions, habits, performances? You never meant to lie, but maybe your feelings were always more like reflections than truths. Reflecting posture, reflecting tone, reflecting the smallest unconscious cues you sent yourself, day after day, until the performance became permanent. Now you're afraid to smile. Not because you don't want to feel better, but because you realize how little control you had over what you used to feel. You wonder if everything you've ever experienced was subject to the same invisible manipulation. If your body has been nudging your mind for years and you never noticed, maybe you're not as honest with yourself as you thought. Maybe you never were. Imagine waking up in a strange room with no memory of how you got there. The air is quiet, too quiet. Across from you sits a man in a white coat. He smiles, says he's a therapist, and asks if you're ready to begin. You don't know what you've agreed to. You don't remember agreeing to anything at all. He tells you to focus on the sound of his voice. He tells you to breathe slowly. He counts down from 10. And by the time he reaches 1, something inside you has shifted. You don't feel drugged. You don't feel different. But when he says stand up, you stand. When he says walk to the door, your feet move without thinking. And then he says something stranger. He says, take the envelope from the shelf and leave it at the corner of 5th and Main. Do not look inside. You don't question it. You just do it. You walk calmly, you place the envelope, and you leave. You never ask why. Later you hear about the robbery. A coordinated event, envelopes placed around the city, triggering some hidden mechanism. Police suspect dozens of people were involved, but none of them remember doing anything. No one remembers why. It sounds like fiction, like a bad movie or a conspiracy theory, but it's not. In 1951, a British hypnotist named George Estabrook claimed he could create what he called super spies. Subjects trained under deep hypnosis to carry out tasks, commit acts, even assassinations, without conscious awareness. They'd wake up hours later with no memory, no guilt, no hesitation. We dismiss this kind of claim now. Too theatrical, too unscientific. But there's something unsettling hiding underneath. Because we know hypnosis can work. We know it can override pain, eliminate phobias, change habits. And we know in controlled settings, people under hypnosis have been led to steal, lie, even hurt others when told it was necessary or justified. They don't question it because their sense of right and wrong shifts, not erased, but reframed. If the voice guiding them is trusted, if the suggestion feels urgent, moral resistance weakens. It doesn't vanish, it just bends. quietly, subtly. You might think, I'd never fall for that. I'm too strong-willed. But that belief is part of the vulnerability. Hypnosis doesn't overpower you. It works with what's already inside you. Your desire to please, your instinct to obey authority, your ability to rationalize. In one study, participants were hypnotized and told to throw acid in someone's face. A staged event, of course. The bottle was fake. The person unharmed, but the participants didn't know that. Most of them hesitated, but did it anyway. Why? Because the person telling them to do it wore a lab coat. Because the suggestion was framed as necessary. Because they were told they could trust him. And maybe that's the key. Hypnosis isn't mind control in the way we imagine. It doesn't replace your will, it redirects it. It takes the parts of you that want to be helpful, agreeable, capable of action, and channels them towards something else, something you might never consciously allow. Now imagine that potential in the wrong hands, not a stage magician, not a therapist, but someone with purpose, someone who wants something done and doesn't want to be caught. They don't need to force you. They just need to find the right suggestions, the right tone, the right authority. And imagine further, you're not hypnotized in a formal session. You're just deeply relaxed, vulnerable, distracted. You're told a story, a simple narrative about duty or threat or sacrifice, something that makes you feel afraid or heroic or guilty. You're nudged, slowly, gently, toward one idea, then another, then a task, and you do it. Not because you're weak, not because you're evil, but because in that moment you believed it was the right thing, the necessary thing, the only thing. You could be led to plant something, take something, hurt someone. If the setup is right, the context believable, your resistance might melt without you ever noticing. You might never even question it until afterward, if you remember it at all. And maybe the most disturbing part is this: it doesn't take hypnosis. Not really. Just suggestion, framing, a trusted voice, repetition, pressure. We already see it every day. Ordinary people, radicalized, convinced to do the unthinkable. Not under a trance, just under influence. So the boundary isn't as clear as we want it to be, between action and intention, between decision and suggestion, between who you are and what you can be made to do. And if someone knew exactly how to speak, how to sequence their words, how to bypass your doubts, would you even know it was happening? Or would you call it your own idea, right up until it was too late to stop? You haven't slept for 2 days. At first it was just hard to focus. A little fog in your thoughts, a slight delay in your reactions. But now the fog is heavier. You find yourself rereading the same sentence again and again. You hear things, faint sounds that aren't there. You start to feel watched, not by someone in the room, but by the room itself. And you begin to question what's real. Not because you're delusional, but because your brain is collapsing under the weight of its own exhaustion. Sleep deprivation doesn't just make you tired. It dismantles your mind, slowly then suddenly. After 72 hours, your grip on reality begins to slip. Your ability to regulate emotion, interpret facial expressions, even recognize the intentions of others, all of it begins to deteriorate. You become paranoid, disconnected, unstable. Your body still functions. You can walk, talk, even work. But your perception becomes unreliable. You can no longer fully trust what you see, hear, or feel. And it doesn't take long for something darker to set in. Studies show that after just a few days of total sleep deprivation, the symptoms are indistinguishable from acute psychosis. Hallucinations, delusions, emotional outbursts. You might scream at someone for a reason that makes perfect sense to you, but no sense at all to them. You might see something terrifying, react in fear, and not realize until much later that it was never there. Your brain is trying to survive without a fundamental process it needs to function. It's not breaking, it's adapting. But that adaptation comes at a cost. It begins to invent patterns, fill in gaps, fabricate meaning where there is none. It hallucinates, not because it wants to, but because it has to. In the absence of sleep, the brain's default state becomes chaos held together by desperate guesswork. And the most unsettling part, you don't notice. Not fully, because the deterioration of your mind is internal, self-contained. You aren't watching it happen, you are it happening. There's no clean moment when you can say, I'm no longer sane. There's just a slow blur between rational and irrational, between memory and imagination, between perception and delusion. You may begin to suspect that others are lying to you, that your loved ones are conspiring against you, that the world around you is shifting in subtle, threatening ways. And every time someone tells you you're imagining things, it reinforces the fear that something is being hidden, that you're right to be afraid, that your paranoia is not paranoia at all, but clarity. And what's terrifying is that this is not rare. It's not unusual. It doesn't require trauma or illness or pre-existing conditions. It just requires staying awake too long. That's it. Anyone can slip into this state. Anyone can break this way. It makes you wonder how much of your sanity depends on simple biological maintenance. How fragile your sense of self really is. You think you are rational, grounded, stable, but remove sleep, and the entire system collapses. Your values, your logic, your personality, they all begin to distort, not because you've changed, but because the machinery that supports them has begun to fail. And if sleep deprivation can do this in days, what happens when people live chronically sleep-deprived lives? What if parts of modern society are already operating in a low-grade state of psychological impairment? What if the aggression, the confusion, the impulsiveness that we see around us isn't moral or cultural, but biological? What if people are just exhausted and their brains have adapted in ways that slowly erase empathy, patience, and critical thought? It's not hard to imagine. Think about the times you've snapped at someone, the arguments that made no sense in hindsight, the conversations where you couldn't remember what you said 5 minutes later. How much of that was personality, and how much was sleep? We assume our thoughts are our own, that what we believe, feel, and decide comes from some deep, authentic place. But maybe most of it is structural, conditional, dependent on chemistry and cycles we barely understand. And when those conditions change, when sleep is taken away, we don't become someone else. We just become unstable versions of who we already are. There's no ceremony, no warning, just a slow dismantling. And the worst part is that it's invisible. You can be standing in a room, fully awake, speaking clearly, even feeling alert, and still be in a state that clinically mimics schizophrenia. You may not be able to tell that your thoughts are broken, because broken thoughts still feel like your own. That's the trap. The moment you need sleep the most is the moment you become least capable of recognizing that you need it. Your internal compass begins to spin, and every emotion, every suspicion, every irrational impulse feels justified. You don't see the distortion. You feel clarity. You feel certain. So you keep going. You try to push through. You tell yourself that sleep is optional, weakness, a delay you can afford to skip. But every hour you stay awake, another part of your mind slips further from the world. You don't crash. You drift, quietly, unnoticed. And by the time someone sees what's happening, you might already be gone, functioning, talking, awake, but lost. Why does a group of people, once kind, rational, and principled, slowly begin to justify what they once found unthinkable. It doesn't happen all at once. At first, someone just says something slightly off, a comment that feels wrong, a joke that's too sharp, but they laugh or shrug or move on. No one pushes back, not really, so it stays. And the next time, it goes a little further, then a little more. No one wants to be the first to speak up. No one wants to be difficult, to ruin the mood, to seem fragile or self-righteous. So they go quiet, and silence becomes consent. The moment passes, but something changes. The line has moved. One person's shift, one infected mind, starts to define what's normal. Their anger spreads. Their fear becomes contagious. Their cruelty starts to sound like common sense. At first, it feels like they're just venting, but eventually, it starts to sound persuasive, even rational, even necessary. You hear the tone of the group shift. The language hardens. Compassion is mocked. Doubt is treated like weakness. What was once unthinkable is now just part of the conversation. You want to believe that you'd speak up, that you'd resist, but part of you hesitates, because it's easier to go along. It's safer to nod quietly, to agree just enough not to stand out. You tell yourself you'll push back later, if it gets worse. But worse is a moving target, and by the time you realize how far things have gone, you've already adjusted. Your silence has shaped the group just as much as their words. It doesn't take force to change a group's morality. It just takes discomfort. The discomfort of being the only one who still believes something is wrong. The discomfort of feeling like you're overreacting, being too sensitive, or imagining things. And so you wait, you give it time. You hope someone else will say something first. But no one does. And now you're part of it. You start to question yourself. Were you overreacting? Was it really that bad? Maybe you misunderstood. Maybe the world has changed. Maybe you're the one who's behind. And the more you doubt yourself, the more you begin to accept what's around you. You don't notice the infection as it spreads. It looks like friendship. It sounds like reason. It feels like belonging. You laugh when they laugh. You agree when they agree. And soon you find yourself saying things you never thought you'd say, thinking things you used to reject, defending actions you once found abhorrent. You don't become evil. You become numb. You find ways to justify it. You say it's complicated. You say people are overreacting. You say there's context. And you believe it, because believing anything else would mean admitting what you've become. And you're not alone. Everyone else is shifting too. Together, you create a new normal. One where cruelty feels honest. One where empathy feels naive. One where morality becomes a performance, strategic, empty, forgettable. You start to notice who's left, who doesn't come around anymore, who fell silent, who stopped laughing. And you don't ask where they went, because you already know. They left when the infection spread, when the group started to rot from within, when the air changed and the smiles turned sharp. But you stayed. You stayed because it felt safer. You stayed because you didn't want to lose them. You stayed because you were afraid to be alone. And now it's too late, because you're not watching the change anymore. You are the change. You're the reason the group feels different. You're the echo of every cruel word. You're the silence after every line crossed. One infected mind was enough, and now there are more. You think about going back, saying something, apologizing, but you can't quite find the words. You've forgotten how they're supposed to sound. And even if you could say them, who would listen? You've already taught them how to ignore a voice like yours. So you stay quiet, you watch. You nod, you laugh, and the group drifts further. Not because anyone wanted to become this, but because no one wanted to be the first to say no. And now there's nothing left to say. Do you ever wonder why you believe what you believe? Not the things you've learned, the things you've chosen, the stories you've accepted, the judgments you defend, the assumptions you never think to question. Why do some ideas feel right, even when they're false? Why do some lies feel more comforting than truth? It's not always a matter of ignorance. Sometimes you know the truth, but it's cold, it's unsettling, it leaves you exposed. So instead, you reach for something softer, a belief that flatters you, a version of the world that's easier to live with. Think about how you respond to praise, how easily you accept it, even when you know it's exaggerated. Now think about criticism, how quickly you rationalize it away. It's not just bias, it's survival. You protect your self-image, even if it means distorting the truth. And it doesn't stop with self-image. It expands. You believe in fairness because it makes injustice feel less permanent. You believe in merit because it makes suffering seem earned. You tell yourself good things happen to good people, not because it's true, but because it keeps you from feeling helpless. You watch others do the same. People believe their leaders are honest, their country is just, their side is right. Even when evidence piles up against them, they cling to what feels safe. They aren't lying to you, they're lying to themselves. But then you look closer, and something more disturbing appears. It's not just them, it's you. You do this too, quietly, invisibly, every day. You choose what to see, what to hear, what to question. You scroll past uncomfortable facts. You nod along with what feels familiar. You construct a version of the world that lets you sleep at night. And you rarely stop to ask, what have I left out? Because you know what it feels like to lose a comforting belief, to realize something you trusted was false. The ground shakes, your certainty dissolves. You start to question everything, and that's not freeing, it's terrifying. So instead, you retreat. You tell yourself it's not the time. You say the truth is too complicated, that it's not worth the fight. And little by little, you turn away from what's real. Not because you want to be deceived, but because you want to feel okay. This is how we all live, surrounded by narratives, half-truths, and selective ignorance. It doesn't matter how educated you are, how skeptical you think you've become. You are still vulnerable to the stories that soothe you. You are still drawn to the version of reality that hurts less. Even science isn't immune. Ideas that challenge the status quo are dismissed, not because they're wrong, but because they're inconvenient. Evidence is buried. Data is spun. Researchers avoid certain questions, not because they're unanswerable, but because they're unacceptable. The truth is, we don't teach the most disturbing ideas. We hide them. We downplay them. We delay them. Because when people truly understand, they might start asking dangerous questions about power, about freedom, about who benefits from the lies. And some truths don't just disturb, they implicate. They reveal what we've done, what we've ignored, what we've become complicit in. And it's easier to believe we didn't know, that we couldn't have known, that the lie was never ours to begin with. But it was. It always is. Every time you accept a comforting lie, you make the next one easier. Every time you reject an uncomfortable truth, you make yourself smaller. You tell yourself the world is simpler than it is. You pretend that reality bends to your feelings, and maybe you need that. Maybe we all do. A little distortion, a little denial to keep going. But there's a cost, because eventually reality breaks through, and when it does, the lies don't protect you. They expose you. They show you what you were willing to believe, just to feel safe. And then there's nothing left to hide behind, just you, and the truth you spent so long avoiding. Imagine you're living your life, ordinary, uneventful, familiar, and then one day, without warning, You react to something small with a kind of rage or fear that doesn't make sense. Not to you, not to anyone around you. A voice gets too loud, a door slams, someone says something the wrong way, and suddenly your heart is racing. Your body floods with adrenaline. You're defending yourself from a threat that isn't there. But what if it was never yours to begin with? What if the fear, the reaction, the impulse, what if it belonged to someone else? Trauma doesn't always stay where it started. Sometimes it travels through family, through relationships, through culture, through behavior. You think you're making your own decisions, forming your own opinions, responding in your own way. But what if you're not? What if some of your deepest instincts are just echoes, residues left behind by someone else's suffering? There's a term for this: transgenerational trauma. Pain that doesn't die with the person who experienced it, but lingers hidden in stories, patterns, warnings passed down without explanation. It doesn't announce itself. It disguises as personality, as instinct, as caution. You might think you're just naturally anxious, or cautious, or guarded. But what if you're not? What if you inherited it? Now think about how you react to stress, how you argue, how you love, how you panic, how you punish yourself. What if those aren't just quirks or habits? What if they're relics, coping mechanisms shaped in someone else's crisis, passed down like heirlooms? You might have never met the person who first felt it. Maybe it was your parent or their parent. Maybe it happened in a war or a famine or a violent home. Maybe the person who first lived it never talked about it. Maybe they never healed, they just coped, adapted, survived. And those adaptations became rules, rules they passed down in silence. Rules you now follow without even realizing. Be quiet, don't trust. Stay alert, don't get too close. Always be prepared for things to go wrong, and you obey. Not because you chose to, but because it feels like the safest way to exist. But here's the unsettling part. These patterns can distort everything: how you see the world, how you interpret others, how you define safety, danger, love, risk. You might push people away, not because they're dangerous, but because your nervous system is convinced connection isn't safe. You might shut down in conflict, not because you're weak, but because someone generations ago learned that silence was the only way to survive. You might think you're broken, but what if you're not broken at all? What if you're just playing out someone else's survival strategy, trapped inside a script that isn't yours? It gets harder when you start to see it everywhere. The way you flinch at compliments, the way you sabotage good things, the way you expect people to leave, to hurt, to betray, even when they don't. Especially when they don't. You start to wonder how much of what you call you is actually just borrowed fear. And then it becomes even more complicated, because trauma doesn't just pass through blood. It spreads through relationships. A friend's pain can become yours. A partner's triggers can shape your behavior. You adjust. You compensate. You tiptoe around unspoken landmines. You learn how to be small, invisible, pleasing. You absorb the atmosphere they bring with them and carry it forward. So now, not only are you shaped by the past, you might be shaping someone else's future. Your children, your friends, the people you love. They see your fear, your reactivity, your tension, and they adjust to you, just like you adjusted to someone else. Just like they will pass it on again, not through malice, not through intention, just through presence, through repetition. That's how it spreads. There's no single trauma, there's a lineage, a pattern repeating quietly, invisibly, until someone sees it. But here's where the real tension starts. Even if you see it, Even if you realize you're acting out someone else's pain, what then? Knowing doesn't undo it. Awareness isn't a cure. You might still feel afraid. You might still overreact. You might still sabotage and avoid and hide. Because the feelings are real, even if their source is distant. Even if they were never truly yours, and you start to feel trapped between understanding and change, between knowing and healing, between the life you live and the one you might have had, if none of this had ever touched you. You begin to realize that parts of your identity might be built on someone else's nightmare, that your sense of self, your defenses, your instincts, your values might be shaped by wounds you never received, only inherited. And that's not something you can erase. It's not something you can fix in a single moment of insight. It's something you carry, something you unlearn slowly, painfully, if you ever can. But the most disturbing part isn't the trauma itself. It's the possibility that you never truly knew who you were to begin with. Imagine someone doing something terrible without flinching, without doubt, without a moment of hesitation. They look into the eyes of another human being and harm them, and they feel certain they're right, certain they're justified, certain they're good. You think certainty belongs to the moral, to those who pause, reflect, question themselves. But often it doesn't. Often certainty lives in the minds of people who never stop to wonder if they might be wrong. Because when you care deeply about doing what's right, every action becomes heavy. Every decision opens a door to doubt. There's always another angle to consider, another consequence to fear. You find yourself hesitating, not because you're weak, but because you're trying to be careful. But someone who doesn't care about being good doesn't carry that weight. They act quickly, speak with conviction. They don't waste time questioning motives or fearing consequences. And from the outside, they look strong, decisive, certain. And you look uncertain, hesitant, weak, because your goodness slows you down. It demands that you stop and think, even when the world around you rewards speed and confidence. It creates a strange illusion. In a room full of voices, the ones who shout the loudest often sound the most convincing, not because they're right, but because they never admit they could be wrong. And over time, something disturbing happens. You start to doubt yourself, not because you've done anything wrong, but because your uncertainty makes you feel small, and their confidence makes them feel powerful. You begin to mistake doubt for weakness. You start to resent the way your conscience slows you down. You wonder if morality is a disadvantage, if goodness in a world like this is a liability. And maybe it is, because to be good, to really care about doing what's right, you have to live with a kind of quiet suffering. You carry questions that never go away. You replay moments in your mind, wondering if you caused harm without realizing. You apologize even when you're not sure you're at fault. You hesitate before judging others. You accept that you might never be certain. But evil doesn't hesitate. It moves quickly, unapologetically. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't seek understanding, and that gives it power. Not because it's righteous, but because it's unburdened. So the world starts to confuse power with clarity. It trusts those who speak without doubt, who act without pause, and it starts to distrust those who reflect too much, care too much, hesitate too much. And maybe that's why evil rises so easily. Not because it's clever or strategic or inevitable, but because it moves faster than goodness. It fills the space that hesitation leaves behind. You might think morality will prevail in the end, that careful, reflective goodness will win. But what if it doesn't? What if the very traits that make you moral also make you less persuasive, less influential, less able to stop what's coming? Because goodness doesn't just require doing the right thing. It requires uncertainty, humility, the willingness to admit you might be wrong. And those qualities make you vulnerable. They leave you open to manipulation, to doubt, to failure. They leave you slower, softer, quieter, and still you choose them. Not because you're certain they'll win, but because for you, certainty isn't the goal. Integrity is. But what if the world no longer rewards that? What if your quiet, thoughtful goodness is drowned out by louder voices, more confident, more ruthless? You want to believe that truth speaks for itself, that kindness has its own strength. But sometimes the truth whispers, and cruelty shouts, and people follow the loudest sound. So you're left with a choice: abandon your doubts and become louder, or hold on to your doubts and risk being ignored. And neither feels right, because to abandon your doubt is to become what you hate. But to keep it means watching the world slide further away from the values you're trying to protect. And that's the trap. That's the quiet horror. Evil feels certain. Goodness feels doubt. And in the space between them, certainty wins, not because it's right, but because it speaks first and loudest. And the longer you think about that, the harder it becomes to know if you're doing the right thing at all. What if you've never truly seen the world as it is? Not because of ignorance or denial, but because your brain decided you shouldn't. Every second, your senses take in far more information than you can consciously process. Sounds, lights, movement, temperature, smells, patterns, changes in pressure, facial micro-expressions, the positioning of your limbs, the weight of your clothes, the rate of your breathing. You notice almost none of it. That's not an accident. It's not a flaw. It's a feature. Your brain is filtering. Constantly, aggressively, silently. It chooses what you notice and what you don't. Not based on truth, but on usefulness. You don't see the full spectrum of light. You don't hear most frequencies. You miss subtle changes in tone, small movements in peripheral vision, gradual shifts in your own emotional state. If something isn't relevant to your immediate survival, your brain ignores it. At first, this sounds efficient, evolutionary, logical. But then you start to wonder how much of reality is being hidden from you. Not by governments, not by media, not by others, but by your own mind. You think you know what's real because you see it. But you only see what your brain allows, and what it allows is based on decisions you didn't make and priorities you didn't choose. You aren't perceiving the world. You're perceiving a narrow, curated version of it. And the worst part, you don't notice the omissions. You can't. The brain doesn't tell you what it deletes. It doesn't warn you when it conceals something. It doesn't whisper, "You would have noticed this, but I filtered it out." It just never appears. You think you're experiencing everything, but you're inside a filtered simulation, customized for usefulness, not truth, simplified, reduced. And the brain doesn't just filter sensory data, it filters ideas too. Contradictory beliefs, moral discomfort, psychological threats, they're softened, blurred, sometimes erased entirely. You forget inconvenient memories. You misremember events in ways that protect your identity. You reinterpret your own past to make it feel more consistent, more stable. You're not just being shielded from noise, you're being protected from yourself. The thoughts you're not allowed to think, the connections you're not allowed to make, the realizations that might destabilize your sense of who you are, those are quietly filtered before you even know they exist. This isn't done maliciously. There's no malice in it, just efficiency. But that makes it more disturbing, because you trust your thoughts. You trust your perceptions. You trust that what you feel is real, that what you see is true, that what you remember happened the way you recall it. You trust your mind, but your mind lies to you constantly, kindly, invisibly, without pause. It removes what you can't handle, and over time you forget that anything was missing. You think of yourself as a rational being, but most of what you experience is pre-selected. Most of what you believe has been shaped by what you were shown and what you weren't. And what if the most important truths about your life, your relationships, your habits, your fears, what if those are the very things your brain decided to hide? Not because they aren't real, but because they were too uncomfortable, too threatening, too likely to make you pause and re-evaluate everything. You imagine your mind as your ally, a loyal partner, but it's more like a public relations firm, constantly editing the raw footage of your existence to make a cleaner narrative. And anything that doesn't fit, anything that complicates the story, it's cut, deleted, forgotten. You don't experience reality. You experience a version of it that's been edited for your psychological convenience, and you didn't choose what gets edited. You never saw the director's cut. You don't even know what scenes were removed. You think the world is confusing because it's chaotic, unpredictable, messy. But maybe it only feels confusing because you're walking through it blindfolded, guided by a brain that keeps removing signposts, redrawing maps, dimming the lights. You think you're awake. But the unsettling truth is that you've only ever seen what your brain lets you see. You've only ever known what it lets you know. And the most disturbing part isn't the filtering itself, it's that you'll never know what was filtered out. Not even a hint, not even a shadow, just silence where there should have been something else. And you'll call that silence reality because it's all you've ever heard. Do you think it feels what you feel? Not in the way you think, not with words or thoughts or stories, but something happens. Quietly, physiologically, measurably. A cascade of chemicals, a shift in heartbeat, the tilt of a developing nervous system, barely forming but already reacting. When you're anxious, it's not just yours to carry. When you're afraid, it registers. Not as a concept, as a signal. A disturbance in the environment it depends on to survive. Before it even knows it exists, it knows something is wrong. There is no distinction between self and world. The mother is the environment. Her breath, her blood, her cortisol and adrenaline. When she suffers, her body becomes a vessel of warning. The fetus doesn't understand the message, but it receives it anyway. The wiring begins differently. A child not yet born begins to form a world built on threat. Even in the safety of the womb, there is a sense that something out there, whatever out there is, cannot be trusted. And so the tiny systems of the brain adjust. Sensitivity to stress increases. The ability to self-regulate begins to distort. The structure of memory and emotion bends to accommodate a life that feels hostile before it even begins. It doesn't need language to feel the storm. It adapts. And maybe that's the part we never talk about. That adaptation isn't always good. Sometimes it's survival, plain and blunt. The fetus doesn't choose to become more reactive, more anxious, more vigilant. It's shaped by the signals it receives. And those signals are ancient, hormonal, biological, unavoidable. So when a pregnant woman experiences trauma, her body floods with stress hormones. These cross the placenta. They reach the fetus. The heartbeat changes. The movements slow. Neural connections form with a different emphasis, prioritizing vigilance, fear, responsiveness to danger. The fetus doesn't know why. It just learns to be ready, but ready for what? It has no idea what kind of world it's preparing for, only that something is wrong. And this knowledge, this felt, physical imprint, becomes part of its foundation. Some children are born with this invisible inheritance. A temperament already tilted. A nervous system primed for threat. Parents notice it, but don't always understand it. Why does this baby flinch so easily? Why won't it settle? Why is it always on edge? The answer may be months older than the child itself. And it complicates everything, because it forces a question that most people don't want to face. What happens when suffering leaves a mark before a person even has a name? This isn't about blame. It's not about guilt. It's about impact. About a body responding to its conditions. If the mother lives in chaos, the fetus learns to expect chaos. If the mother is afraid, the fetus absorbs that fear, not emotionally, but biologically, and then is born into a world that expects it to start fresh. It arrives carrying a history it cannot describe, a physiological memory of stress that has no beginning and no story, only effect. It starts to form habits of the nervous system, tendencies of reaction, instincts shaped by chemical shadows, and no one sees it happen. There is no moment where you can point and say this is when the damage occurred. It isn't damage, exactly. It's preparation. The body preparing for danger without knowing what form that danger will take. Some will say children are resilient, that they adapt. That early stress is just part of life. But adaptation has a cost. When the foundation of a mind is built under threat, the rest of life becomes about finding safety that was never there to begin with. It can take years to recognize that feeling, decades. Some never do. And still, the imprint remains, quietly influencing everything. How trust is formed, how fear is managed, how calm is felt, or never found. It becomes part of how the body interprets the world. A baseline of unease that no one remembers starting. So imagine being shaped by fear you never chose, carrying stress you never earned, feeling anxious before you had thoughts, adapting to pain before you had form. And now imagine how invisible that all is. How easily it's misunderstood, dismissed, ignored. How quickly people will ask why someone is so sensitive, so reactive, so anxious, as if the answer started at birth. As if it didn't start long before that. And the most disturbing part isn't just that stress can be passed down like this. It's that it can be normalized. A person can live their entire life carrying this weight, never knowing it isn't theirs, never realizing their body was shaped by someone else's suffering. And maybe that's the quiet horror of it all, that you can be born already afraid. Have you ever trusted a memory more than the moment you're actually in? You can feel it vividly, where you were standing, the way the air felt, even what someone said. You can replay it as if it's stored in high definition, unchanging, absolute, but then someone else remembers it differently. They say it didn't happen that way, that you weren't even there, and something strange happens. You're not just confused, you're angry, defensive, because the memory feels real. It feels undeniable. But what if it isn't? What if the moment you're clinging to never actually happened? False memories aren't just gaps in perception. They're not a fuzziness around the edges. They can feel more vivid than real ones, more emotionally charged, more coherent, more convincing. And once they're there, once they've settled into place, you'll protect them, even if they contradict evidence. Even if someone shows you the truth, you'll still believe the lie, because it doesn't feel like a lie. That's what makes it so disturbing. You don't just misremember details, you insert entire events, entire feelings, entire decisions that never existed. You live with them, build on them, trust them, shape who you are around them. And then one day, something cracks. Someone shows you a video or a photograph or a record that proves it didn't happen the way you swore it did. And for a second, your mind doesn't just doubt the memory, it doubts itself. It doubts you. Because if one memory can be false, what about the others? What if entire chapters of your life are built on things that never happened? It's not just embarrassing, it's destabilizing. Because your memories aren't just history, they're identity. They're the way you tell the story of who you are. And if they can be wrong, completely wrong, then what happens to the story? Some false memories are harmless. You think you saw a movie you never watched. You remember a friend being at a party they never attended. But sometimes it's darker than that. You remember being betrayed, hurt. You remember someone doing something unforgivable, and you carry that pain for years. You live inside the emotional aftermath of something that never occurred, and then maybe you find out it was false. The betrayal didn't happen. The hurt was imagined, not because you lied, but because your brain constructed the memory so convincingly that it became real to you. And now, what are you supposed to do with that anger, that resentment, that sense of injustice you've been holding on to? It doesn't just disappear, it stays. Even when the truth is revealed. Because memory isn't about truth, it's about narrative, about coherence, about what feels real, not what is real. And once something feels real, it becomes real. You can't just erase it. Think about how terrifying that is. Someone could plant a memory in your mind, not with force, not with hypnosis, just a suggestion, a vivid story, a moment of vulnerability, and your brain might accept it. Fill in the details, build emotion around it, wrap your identity around it, and now it's yours. You defend it, swear by it, take action because of it, and never once suspect that it wasn't true. Now imagine this happening, not once, but over and over. Small inaccuracies, subtle shifts. Slowly your life becomes a version of events that never really occurred. A slightly warped story, one you trust, but one that's built on fragments, on inventions, on errors. And the more you retell it, the stronger it becomes, the more certain you feel, until certainty itself becomes the lie, and there's no way to reverse it. Because once a false memory is in place, correcting it doesn't feel like healing. It feels like an attack, like someone trying to take something from you. You resist, you defend, because your identity depends on it. You begin to realize that your past is less a record and more a construction, a fragile, subjective creation. And if that's true, then who are you really? Are you a person shaped by what happened to you or what you believe happened? And how would you know the difference? Now imagine someone else is remembering you falsely. They're certain you hurt them, lied to them, abandoned them. And no matter what you say, they're convinced. They've built years of pain around that memory, years of distrust, and they look at you as if you're the villain in their story, a story you don't even recognize. You want to defend yourself, correct them, but it doesn't matter. Because to them, the memory is real, the emotion is real, the consequences are real. And maybe you've done the same to someone else. Maybe you've spent years avoiding someone, resenting someone, mourning something because of a memory that never happened. Maybe you're punishing someone right now for a false past, and you'll never know. That's the horror of false memory. It's not just that we forget, it's that we remember with absolute certainty things that never occurred, and we act on those memories, build our lives around them, make choices because of them, and sometimes destroy relationships that could have been saved because we were sure, because we trusted the wrong past. And the worst part is, you never feel the moment it happens. You only feel the certainty, the emotion, the story that seems too vivid, too detailed, too personal to be wrong. But it can be, and maybe it already is. You're afraid of something that's never happened to you. Not because you've seen it in others, not because someone warned you, but because the shape of it already lives inside your mind, and that's enough to make you flinch. You've never drowned, but the thought of sinking, lungs filling slowly, limbs going still, makes you catch your breath. You've never been buried alive, but the idea of a sealed coffin, the finality of it, the darkness, makes your chest tighten. You've never lost your mind, but something in you recoils at the image of confusion that never ends, of forgetting who you are, or worse, remembering just enough to know that you've lost yourself. Fear doesn't wait for evidence. It doesn't need proof. It builds itself out of suggestion, instinct, imagination, and somehow that's enough. You can fear pain you've never felt. You can dread the loss of things you've never had. You can feel haunted by memories that never happened. Because the brain doesn't always distinguish between experience and anticipation. To fear something is, in a small way, to have already lived it. And sometimes what you fear most isn't something you saw, but something you understood too well the moment you first heard about it. Think about how some fears feel foreign, like being attacked or falling from a great height, but others feel like they've always been part of you. The fear of abandonment, the fear of being misunderstood, the fear of never being truly known. Those didn't come from a story or a warning. They arrived wordlessly, as if they were always meant to be there. And if you can fear something that never happened, what does that say about the boundary between memory and imagination, between knowledge and experience? You're afraid of things because they could happen, because something in you believes they might. But what happens when that belief becomes so powerful, so emotionally vivid, that your body reacts anyway? The heart races, the skin goes cold, the thoughts spiral, none of it waiting for reality to catch up. You feel as though you're living through something, even though nothing is happening at all. This is where fear stops being protective and starts becoming corrosive. When you begin responding not just to what is, but to what could be. When possibility becomes indistinguishable from threat. You walk into a room and expect judgment. You wake up and brace for loss. You prepare for betrayal before anyone has hurt you. And the worst part is, it feels rational. It feels like you're being cautious, careful, smart. But it's not protection, it's rehearsal. You're living through an imagined pain so many times that the absence of it begins to feel suspicious. When nothing bad happens, you don't feel safe. You feel like something must be wrong. And over time, that imagined pain carves deep grooves into your thinking. You expect failure. You expect disappointment. You expect to be let down. So when those things finally come, because eventually they always do, they don't surprise you. They confirm what you already believed. They feel familiar, almost comfortable. You never experienced the original wound. You just built your life around the scar. But what if that fear was wrong? What if the thing you've been bracing for isn't real? Not because it couldn't happen, but because it didn't. What if your entire posture, your defenses, your walls, your expectations were built in response to something that never arrived? Would you know how to stand differently? And what would it take to admit that most of your fear has been directed towards shadows? That the suffering you've been protecting yourself from never happened, not out there, at least, only inside you. In the vivid emotional simulations your mind creates every time you imagine the worst and feel it as if it's already true, because fear doesn't wait for proof. It never has. And you don't need to survive something to be shaped by it. Sometimes fear is just another way of remembering something that never happened. But still, it leaves its mark. It teaches you to flinch before you're touched, to run before you're chased, to mourn before anything is lost. And quietly, without meaning to, you become someone who lives in preparation for a pain that might never come. But you feel it anyway. Imagine someone gives you a button. They tell you it doesn't do anything. It's not connected to any real system. Pressing it won't change the outcome of anything important. And yet, just having the button makes you feel calmer. You feel more in control, more secure, less helpless. And that's the part that should unsettle you, because it means your brain doesn't need real control to feel safe. It only needs the illusion of it. The idea that you could do something, even if that something is meaningless, is enough to reduce stress, lower anxiety, and convince you that the situation is manageable. This is why people press the close door button in elevators, even when it's disconnected. It's why gamblers feel confident in games of pure chance. It's why people stuck in impossible situations still search obsessively for small routines, actions, or habits that let them feel like they're in charge. It doesn't matter that none of it works. The feeling is what matters. The illusion is enough. But if the illusion of control can calm you, then it also means your emotional state is being shaped not by truth, but by deception. Your body reacts to something false as though it's real. Your stress subsides, not because you're safe, but because your mind believes a lie. And if that's true, how much of your peace has been built on these kinds of illusions? How often do you choose actions not because they're effective, but because they soothe you? Washing your hands repeatedly, rechecking a locked door, making to-do lists you never finish. None of it really protects you, but it feels like it does. It gives you a script, a role to play, a way to pretend you're not powerless. It's comforting, it's human, and it's dangerous. Because if a false sense of control is all it takes to calm your brain, then someone, somewhere can give it to you on purpose. They can hand you fake buttons, empty rituals, meaningless choices, and you'll accept them. You'll thank them. You'll feel safer without ever being safer. This is the architecture of manipulation, the blueprint for quiet control. Create the illusion that people are choosing freely. Let them pick between options that don't matter. Let them vote, speak, complain, as long as none of it changes the outcome. As long as they believe they have influence, they won't rebel, they won't panic. They won't even notice the walls. You might think you'd recognize this. You might believe you're too smart to be fooled, but the evidence says otherwise. In countless experiments, people were given fake controls, buttons that didn't work, switches that changed nothing, and nearly all of them believed they were having an effect. They reported feeling more comfortable, more focused, more in charge. Even when shown the truth, some refused to believe it, because the truth, that they were powerless, was more frightening than the lie. And now the question becomes harder. If the illusion of control is enough to make you feel safe, would you want to know if it was false? If you were trapped in a system rigged against you, but the illusion of influence kept you calm, would you choose to see through it? Or would you rather keep pressing your button, pretending it works, because the alternative is too unbearable to face? Maybe you already know the answer. Maybe you've already chosen the illusion. Maybe you've already made peace with pretending. And maybe deep down, that's what keeps you calm at night, not because you believe you're in control, but because you've accepted the comfort of not knowing for sure. Because nothing is more disturbing than the thought that every time you felt calm, it might have only been because someone let you feel that way. Imagine waking up one morning and not knowing who you are, not in the dramatic sense of amnesia, but quietly, subtly. You remember your name, your job, where you live, but something underneath all of it feels missing, hollow, like your sense of self isn't something solid, but something fragile, something rehearsed? What if everything you believe about who you are is just a story you've been telling yourself for years? Not a lie, exactly. Not something conscious or deceptive. Just a loop, a pattern, a set of memories and labels, repeated so often they begin to feel like truth. You call it your identity. But is it really? You remember certain events. You define yourself by them. You tell people, this happened to me, and that's why I am this way. You carry your traumas, your successes, your beliefs like a script. And maybe you think the script is fixed, written by the past, grounded in fact. But memory doesn't work like that. Memory isn't a recording, it's a reconstruction. Each time you recall something, you're not retrieving a file, you're rebuilding it, rewriting it, changing it, slightly, subtly. And with every retelling, you reinforce the version that feels most familiar, most useful, most comforting. So what happens when you realize that your memories aren't stable, that they shift with your mood, your expectations, your fears? What does that mean for the self that depends on them? Think about the way you explain yourself to others. You have certain lines you repeat, things you always mention, things you always leave out. The story of you is curated, edited, built to make sense of what otherwise might feel chaotic, overwhelming, random. But the more often you tell it, the more you believe it's the only version that exists. Now think about the parts of yourself you don't talk about, the moments that don't fit your narrative, the contradictions you bury, the times you acted completely out of character. Do you discard those because they're not part of who you are, or because they threaten the story you've chosen to believe? And here's the question that follows. If your sense of self depends on selective memory and repeated storytelling, what happens when the story breaks? What if something happens that doesn't fit? A decision you can't justify, a feeling you can't explain, a change in behavior that makes no sense, even to you. Suddenly, the narrative slips, the loop glitches, and you're left staring at yourself like a stranger. Have you ever felt that, briefly, that disconnection? That sense that you're watching yourself from outside, wondering who exactly this person is and how they became you. Some people chase that feeling, calling it awakening. Others fear it, calling it crisis. But either way, it reveals something fundamental. Your identity is not a fact, it's a process, a performance, a constantly updated interpretation of a messy, ambiguous life. And like any performance, it depends on rehearsal, on consistency. You wear the same expressions, use the same phrases, make the same choices, not because they're inevitable, but because they're familiar, because they let you keep believing. The loop is true, but what if you stopped repeating it? What if you let go of the story, even briefly? What would be left? Most people never do. Not because they can't, but because they're terrified of what they might find underneath. The idea that there is no core self, only shifting patterns of thought, emotion, and behavior, feels unbearable, like a kind of death. A disappearance. But maybe that's the real story, the one you can't quite admit to yourself, that your identity isn't something you are, it's something you do, something you maintain. And if you stop doing it, even for a moment, you'd vanish, not physically, not publicly, but internally, privately, quietly. And that's the fear, isn't it? That if you stopped believing the story, no one would be there to hear the silence. So you keep telling it, not because it's true, not because it's fixed, but because it's all you have. You tell the story again, and again, and again, until the loop becomes you, or at least enough of you to make the silence bearable. What hurts more, being punched in the face or being left out of a conversation? You might laugh at the comparison. It feels absurd. Physical pain is real, measurable, visible. Social rejection is just emotional. You get over it. You move on. That's what we tell ourselves. But your brain doesn't seem to agree. When someone ignores you, excludes you, mocks you behind your back, your brain lights up in the same regions that process physical pain. The anterior cingulate cortex, the insula, the same neural networks that respond to a burn, a bruise, a broken bone. You don't just feel embarrassed, you feel wounded. And that makes something very clear. Your sense of belonging isn't just emotional, it's biological. Evolution has wired it into you as a necessity, not a luxury. The same way your body screams when you touch a hot stove, your mind screams when you're left out. Because to be alone, in a world built for groups, is a threat to survival. You think you're independent, strong, rational. But when someone turns away from you, doesn't respond to your message, doesn't invite you in, you start to ache. You feel tension in your chest. You feel nauseous. Your stomach tightens. You can't sleep. You replay the moment over and over, like poking at a sore tooth. And you tell yourself it's nothing. But your body knows it isn't. Imagine you're back in middle school. You walk into a room. Everyone looks at you and then looks away. No words. No explanation. Just that sudden, suffocating silence. You don't know what you did. You don't know why they've turned against you. All you know is that something inside you just collapsed. Your brain files it the same way it would file a broken leg. And here's where it becomes more disturbing. Because physical pain fades. But rejection can loop. It plays over and over in your mind. Your body heals from a bruise, but that moment when you were made to feel like you didn't matter, it carves itself into your memory like a scar you can't stop tracing. And the more you remember it, the more your brain relives it. The pain isn't just recalled, it's reactivated. You're not imagining it. You're re-experiencing it. Even subtle rejection, when someone forgets your name, interrupts you, makes a joke at your expense, can create a cascade in your nervous system. A kind of inflammation of the self. And the more it happens, the more sensitive you become, like a nerve ending left exposed. Eventually, you start to fear it preemptively. You lower your voice, you speak less. You stop reaching out. You retreat before you're pushed away. You tell yourself you don't care. But deep down, you're building your life around the terror of not belonging. And that's the trap. Because to protect yourself, you begin to isolate. You numb, you disconnect. You avoid the possibility of rejection by avoiding connection entirely. You convince yourself that you prefer being alone, that you're above it, that you've grown out of needing others. But your brain doesn't believe you. You might not notice it, but the loneliness starts to change you. Your immune system weakens. Your cortisol levels rise. You become more irritable, more anxious, more paranoid. You begin to interpret neutral faces as hostile. You hear judgment where none exists. You become convinced that everyone secretly dislikes you, not because it's true, but because your nervous system is preparing for another wound. It's trying to brace for the next hit. And the irony is, the more you pull away, the more you increase the very pain you're trying to avoid. You reject others before they can reject you. You become cold, guarded, distant. And people do start to turn away. Not because you're unworthy, but because you've made it impossible for them to reach you. And now, your fear is confirmed. Your pain becomes prophecy. You think of yourself as rational, logical, autonomous. But rejection, real or imagined, can bend your perception, warp your memory, distort your behavior. It can shape the trajectory of your entire life without you ever realizing why. You might think you've moved past an old wound, but years later, a small comment can trigger that same buried ache. A glance, a pause, a missed invitation. And suddenly, you're 12 years old again, standing outside a closed door, wondering why you weren't let in. And here's the part you don't want to believe. Even cruelty can feel better than indifference. Being mocked, insulted, criticized, it still means you exist in someone's mind, but being ignored, being invisible, it's as if you don't exist at all. That's why silence can feel so violent, because when the body is attacked, it defends itself. But when the self is erased, it doesn't know how to fight back. So you carry that pain with you, quietly, privately. You smile through it. You laugh it off, but somewhere deep inside, your brain is still treating it like an open wound. And every small rejection, every silence, every exclusion pours salt into it again. You start to wonder how many of your choices were shaped, not by desire, but by fear. Not by love, but by the need to avoid pain. How many friendships you clung to just to avoid loneliness. How many conversations you avoided just to stay safe. How many times you stayed quiet, not because you had nothing to say, but because you feared no one would listen. And maybe now you understand something you've always tried to deny, that some of the deepest pain you've ever felt didn't leave a mark anyone else could see. Why do people follow rules when they don't have to? Imagine you live in a world where there is no visible authority, no police, no cameras, no consequences. You could steal, lie, hurt others, and no one would know. There would be no punishment, no retaliation, no price. But still, most people wouldn't. They'd hold back. They'd act decently. They'd behave as if someone was watching, even when no one is. Why? It's not fear, not anymore. It's belief. A quiet, internalized sense that wrongdoing brings punishment, even when proof is absent, even when no one is there to see it. You cross a line, and something inside you recoils. A quiet voice, impossible to locate. A feeling of being seen, watched, judged. Not by others, not by any system, but by something embedded in your own mind. Maybe it started in childhood. Small infractions followed by guilt, fear, the warning that someone was always watching. Parents, teachers, God. Every rule reinforced, not just with consequence, but with belief. The idea that wrongness itself carried weight. That breaking rules damaged something larger than yourself. Over time, that belief took root, grew deep, until eventually it didn't need reminders. The punishment became internal, invisible, self-sustaining. And now, even alone, with no one else around, the same instincts remain. You hesitate. You obey. You imagine consequence where none exists. You fear what you cannot see. But where does that fear come from? It's not logic. Logically, if no punishment exists, nothing should stop you. But people still stop. They self-regulate. They walk the line. They punish themselves with guilt, anxiety, dread, because something in them believes there is always a price. Even if they no longer believe in God, even if they know the surveillance cameras are off, even if they're completely alone, the belief remains. That moral wrongness attracts consequence. That some force, seen or unseen, keeps track. Tallies up each lie, each betrayal, each act of harm. Sometimes this belief takes religious form. Sometimes it looks like karma. Sometimes it's just an unspoken sense of cosmic fairness. But the shape doesn't matter. The effect is the same. People behave. They conform. They monitor themselves. And if they do slip, if they cross a line, they expect something to go wrong. They wait for it. They look over their shoulder. They brace for punishment, even when there's no logical reason to. And if nothing happens, that's worse. Now they feel something is out of balance. An account open and unresolved. So they begin punishing themselves. Subtly, quietly. sabotaging their own peace, distrusting good fortune, expecting the fall. This belief creates a kind of moral gravity, a pull toward behavior that aligns with invisible consequences, not out of rational fear, but out of a deeper, unshakable feeling that the world keeps score, and over time, this becomes indistinguishable from morality. Not because it's based in truth, but because it works, because the idea of punishment, just the belief in it, is enough to shape how people act, even when no one is watching, even when nothing is real. You might think this is a good thing, that it keeps society stable, but think carefully. If your goodness depends on the belief in punishment, is it goodness at all, or just fear, dressed up as virtue? And what happens when that belief fades? What do you become when you finally stop expecting the fall? When you do something wrong and nothing happens? Do you feel free? Or does something inside you break? Because the fear of punishment didn't just keep you in line, it held you together. It gave shape to your guilt, your choices, your restraint. Without it, what remains? And what if the answer is nothing? What if the only thing stopping people from turning cruel, selfish, destructive is a ghost, a phantom law, a lie whispered in childhood, a belief no one ever proved, but one that still governs you, silently, completely? And maybe the most disturbing part isn't that people believe in punishment without proof. It's how much they need to. You remember what you saw, but how do you know it was real? Not just real in the physical sense, but real in the way you trust your memory, your perception, your belief that what you experienced actually happened, and happened as you think it did. You felt sure at the time. You still feel sure now, but certainty isn't a guarantee. It's a feeling, and feelings can be wrong. Your eyes took in a scene. Your brain filled in the rest. You noticed what you expected to see. You ignored what didn't fit. You didn't mean to. You didn't choose to. It just happened, silently, automatically. That's how perception works. It's not passive. It's constructed. You don't see the world as it is. You see the world as your mind expects it to be. When something matches your assumptions, your brain relaxes. It stops questioning. It smooths the edges, simplifies the complexity, and tells you this is reality. This is safe. This is known. But when something breaks that expectation, when it's too unfamiliar, too uncomfortable, your mind doesn't just notice. Sometimes it edits, it erases, it rewrites. You remember someone's face. Later you swear they were smiling, but they weren't. You just expected them to be. You remember a conversation. Later you recall them agreeing with you, but they didn't. You just needed them to. Your memory isn't a recording, it's a reconstruction. And reconstructions are always vulnerable to suggestion. Even more disturbing, the more confident you feel in a memory, the more likely it is to be false. Confidence doesn't come from accuracy, it comes from coherence. The pieces fit together. The story makes sense. So your brain says, yes, this happened, but it didn't. Or not exactly, or not at all. Think about eyewitness testimony. People who saw the same event, who swear they remember it perfectly, often give wildly different accounts. Each person's mind filled in gaps differently. Each one built a version of reality that matched their internal model, and none of them are lying. They're just wrong. This isn't rare. This is normal. Your brain does it constantly. It takes a noisy, chaotic world and turns it into something manageable. It filters, it simplifies, it constructs a narrative. You see what you expect to see, and what doesn't fit often disappears before you even notice. Now imagine how this plays out in your everyday life. You meet someone new. They remind you of someone you disliked. Without realizing it, you expect them to act the same way. So you interpret their behavior through that lens. You notice signs of rudeness, arrogance, or dishonesty, even if they aren't there. And slowly, your expectation becomes your reality. Or maybe it's the opposite. You admire someone, trust them, expect them to be good. So you overlook their faults, ignore their missteps, excuse their harm. You protect the image you've created, even when evidence contradicts it. Because you aren't just seeing them, you're seeing your version of them. The version you need to see. Now extend this further. Think about your beliefs, about politics, about morality, about yourself. Every new piece of information gets filtered through what you already believe. If it fits, you accept it without question. If it doesn't, you doubt it, discard it, or reinterpret it until it does. Not because you're dishonest, but because your brain protects its models, it resists contradiction. This is why it's so hard to change your mind. Why it feels painful to confront evidence that challenges your worldview. It's not just discomfort, it's disorientation. Your internal map doesn't match the terrain anymore, and rather than redraw the map, your brain tries to reshape the world. And here's the quiet horror: you can't tell when it's happening. You can't feel your expectations warping your perception. You don't notice the edits your mind makes in real time. You simply experience a version of reality that feels true and never suspect how much of it was imagined. Now ask yourself, how often has this happened without your awareness? How many memories are wrong? How many judgments were distorted? How many truths have you ignored simply because they didn't fit? You might think you're careful, that you're logical, that you check your biases, but expectations don't announce themselves. They whisper, they nudge, and by the time you notice, it's too late. The damage is already done. The story has already been rewritten. And maybe the most disturbing part isn't that you can't trust what you see. It's that you rarely realize you shouldn't. Because the illusion isn't in what you observe. It's in how convinced you are that you observed it clearly. That feeling of certainty is the trap, and you never feel the moment you fall into it. What if the reason you can't face the truth is because something inside you is trying to protect you from it? Not protect you from danger, but from clarity, from a kind of seeing that changes everything, a kind of knowing that doesn't feel safe. There's something strange that happens when you begin to get close to a difficult truth. Not just a fact or a belief, but a truth that undermines how you see the world or how you see yourself. At first, it feels like discomfort. You feel restless, tired, distracted. You think it's a lack of interest. You tell yourself the idea isn't useful, or that it's wrong, or that it doesn't matter. You feel sure of that until you try to explain why. And suddenly, you can't. You feel cornered, defensive, irritated, and you don't know why. That's resistance. Not to a threat, but to an update. A rewrite. Some part of your brain is trying to hold the system together, because if this truth is allowed in, just one step too far, it threatens to collapse something bigger. Sometimes what it threatens is pride. You realize you were wrong, deeply, for a long time. Or you see how your beliefs weren't yours at all. They were inherited, implanted, copied, and now they no longer make sense. But if they go, what's left? Sometimes the truth threatens your sense of safety. You see that the people around you aren't who you thought they were, that the system you rely on doesn't care about you, that the future you've been working toward might not exist. Other times it's more personal. You realize your motives aren't what you believed, that your compassion has limits, that your identity is built on fragile stories, stories that no longer hold up under pressure. And still, the truth keeps knocking, quietly, persistently. But instead of opening the door, your mind finds ways to turn away. You scroll, you argue, you sleep. You convince yourself you've already understood it, that there's nothing more to see. But the resistance doesn't stop because the truth is dangerous. It continues because the truth is real and reality. When it's painful, it's hard to absorb all at once. So your brain slows it down. It filters, it delays, it rationalizes. Not because it wants to lie, but because it wants to survive. A stable worldview, even if false, feels safer than a broken one. And yet, sometimes something breaks through. A crack forms, a moment slips past your defenses. And for a second you see it. The thing you were avoiding. The truth beneath the noise. It's small, simple. But when you see it clearly, something inside you shifts. And then you look away. You tell yourself it was nothing. You move on. But the crack stays. And from that moment on, the lie becomes harder to carry. The distractions lose their grip. The resistance weakens. That's how truth gets in. Not all at once, but slowly, painfully, repeatedly, until your mind no longer has the energy to keep it out. And when it finally enters fully, quietly, completely, it doesn't shout, it doesn't argue. It just sits there, undeniable. And in that moment, you feel what your resistance was trying to protect you from all along. The grief, the shame, the fear, the disorientation of knowing that something important has changed and there's no going back. Because the truth doesn't just give you knowledge, it takes something from you. An illusion, a comfort, a version of yourself you were never ready to lose. And maybe that's why your brain fights so hard to keep it out. Not because it's false, but because it's final. Because once it gets in, something else must die. And that part of you doesn't want to die. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Imagine you're in pain. Real pain. The kind that makes your body clench and your thoughts narrow until there's no room for anything else. Someone hands you a pill. You swallow it, and slowly the pain dulls. The sharpness fades. Your body relaxes. You can breathe again. But something else fades with it. Something quieter, harder to notice, harder to name. You see someone else hurting. Maybe they've lost someone. Maybe they're overwhelmed, breaking down in front of you. You know what pain looks like. You remember what it feels like. But now, you don't feel it with them. You don't flinch at their grief. You understand it, but you don't feel it. Not the way you used to. And you wonder, did the pill take that too? Most people think painkillers only numb the body. They believe relief comes cleanly. That you take the pill, the suffering stops, and nothing else changes. But science suggests otherwise. That the very mechanism that dulls your own pain may also dull your capacity to feel the pain of others. Empathy lives in the same part of the brain that processes physical pain, their neighbors. Sometimes they're even the same room. When you hurt for someone else, your body mimics that hurt. Your brain fires as if the pain is your own. That's what makes you flinch when someone is slapped. What makes you cry when someone breaks down. But if that signal is blocked, if your brain is told not to respond, what else is lost? The pill doesn't know what kind of pain it's silencing. It doesn't distinguish between the ache in your back and the ache in your chest when someone else suffers. It just quiets the signal. And with that quiet comes a kind of distance. You start to notice it, maybe in small ways. Someone around you cries, and you feel flat, not cruel, not indifferent, just distant. You offer words, but not warmth. Comfort, but not connection. It's as if there's a glass wall between you and their pain. You can see it, but you can't touch it, can't feel it. And maybe you think that's fine. Maybe you prefer it that way. After all, who wants to carry the weight of everyone else's pain? Who wants to be crushed by the sadness of others when your own body already carries so much? But what happens when that distance grows? What happens when you stop flinching entirely? When suffering becomes something you observe but no longer absorb? When pain becomes data, not feeling? Empathy isn't just about kindness. It's what keeps us connected. It's what makes cruelty feel wrong. Without it, harm becomes easier to watch, easier to justify, and eventually easier to cause. You start to notice you're less patient, less moved, less responsive, not because you've become worse, but because you've become quieter inside. Numb in places you didn't know could go numb. You still care, in theory. But the urgency is gone. The impulse to reach out, to hold someone, to feel with them, that part has dimmed. And if painkillers can do that, even just a little, even just temporarily, what does that mean for a society built on shared suffering? What happens when millions of people are quietly, chemically softened? What happens when we all start feeling a little less of each other? It sounds like safety, like comfort, but it might be something else. A slow erosion of connection, a quiet numbing drift away from compassion. And maybe it doesn't stop at pills. Maybe this is just one example of something bigger. A world where we keep finding ways to dull the sharpness of feeling. Not just pain, but everything that comes with it. Grief, empathy, moral urgency. Because empathy hurts. And maybe we're starting to believe that hurt itself is the problem. You might think this is worth the trade, that being spared your own pain is worth the loss of feeling someone else's. That comfort matters more than connection. But then ask yourself this: what kind of person do you become when you stop truly feeling the pain of others? What kind of world do we build when suffering is something we recognize but no longer feel? And what if that numbness doesn't go away when the pill wears off? What if the part of you that could once hurt for others never quite comes back? What if your brain knew something wasn't true, but let you believe it anyway? Not by mistake, not because it was confused, but because quietly, beneath your awareness, it made a decision to protect the story, to preserve the shape of the world you think you live in. Even if it meant discarding what was real, it happens more often than you think. You remember someone being cruel, even though they never were. You're convinced a conversation happened, but everyone else says it didn't. You feel certain about your childhood until you find a photo that proves you wrong. These aren't just memory errors, they're repairs, patches your brain installs to keep the narrative smooth. Because coherence matters more than accuracy. Your mind doesn't want truth. It wants continuity, a stable self, a consistent world. And when reality threatens that stability, when something doesn't fit, it gets rewritten, softened, or forgotten. You've likely done this already today. Maybe you explained away a failure with a story that made you look better. Or you ignored evidence that challenged your beliefs. Not because you're dishonest, but because the alternative to face inconsistency, contradiction, chaos feels unbearable. Your brain chooses comfort, not clarity, and it doesn't ask for your permission. When something violates your self-image, your brain often won't let it in. You think you're open-minded, but you silently filter out data that disagrees. You believe your judgments are fair, but you overlook evidence of bias. You trust your memories, but they're stitched together from fragments, edited constantly to preserve a version of you that feels whole. It's not just denial, it's design. Brains evolved not to seek truth, but to survive. And in a dangerous, unpredictable world, a stable identity is a survival tool. If every mistake shattered your self-concept, you'd collapse. So the brain protects the illusion of continuity. Even if it means lying to itself, you start to see the cost. When someone points out an inconsistency, you feel attacked, not because they're wrong, but because they're threatening the system. The internal logic you depend on to feel like a person. You defend beliefs you don't fully understand. You double down when challenged. You'd rather be wrong and consistent than right and fractured. That's the trade. Truth is fragile. It's often uncomfortable, sometimes destabilizing, but consistency feels safe. So your brain makes a quiet choice: stability over accuracy, narrative over nuance, identity over insight. And you live inside that choice without ever noticing. But sometimes the cracks show. You catch yourself lying and wonder why. You feel shame after defending something you no longer believe. You remember something differently than others do and feel a small, cold doubt, a flicker of dissonance. Not enough to wake you up, just enough to make you uneasy. You explain it away, again, and the cycle continues. The brain rewrites. You accept the edits. Reality bends just a little, and then a little more, until you're not sure where the truth ends and your version of it begins. And maybe, deep down, you don't want to know. Because to know would mean unraveling, admitting you've been living in a story that isn't fully real. A self built on selective memory, biased perception, motivated reasoning. A fragile architecture, always at risk of collapse. And the collapse isn't hypothetical. It's what happens during crisis, during grief, during trauma, when your internal story is torn apart and you're left without a center. Not because you lost something outside, but because the narrative you lived by no longer holds. Your brain can't stitch it together anymore, and you feel it. The raw, unbearable weight of inconsistency. That's when you understand why the lie was there, why your brain protected it for so long. Not because you were weak, but because you needed it. And now you're left with a question that lingers quietly in the dark. If your brain hides the truth to protect you, how would you ever know what's real? Why did you do nothing? That's the question that lingers. The one that gets whispered when everything else has gone quiet. Not why did no one help? Not why did they all just watch? But why did you stand there still, frozen, silent? You remember the moment clearly. The way people looked at each other, waiting. The way the tension built, like something invisible was pressing on everyone's chest. Someone needed help. Maybe they were on the ground, maybe they were shouting, maybe they were too quiet, but everyone saw. No one moved, you didn't move, and at the time, you told yourself the usual things. Someone else probably already called for help. Someone closer will step in. Maybe it isn't serious, maybe it isn't safe, maybe it's none of your business. The excuses came quickly, effortlessly, and so you stood there, just like everyone else. Later you learned the term for it, the bystander effect. The more people there are, the less likely anyone is to act. Responsibility diffuses, vanishes into the crowd. You weren't alone, but that made it worse. You waited because others waited. They hesitated because you did. And in that loop of shared silence, nothing happened. But something did happen. Someone suffered. Someone needed help and didn't get it. Not because people were cruel, but because they weren't kind enough to act alone. And this is where it starts to get darker. Because you think of yourself as a good person. You think in the right moment you'd step forward. But the right moment never announces itself. It just happens. Quietly, suddenly. And you realize afterward that you missed it. That you had a chance to prove who you are, and you did nothing. The worst part is that no one tells you you failed. No one confronts you, punishes you. In fact, No one even notices. You walk away, unseen, unblamed, but you carry something with you. A small hollow weight, the awareness that your goodness is conditional, that kindness, under pressure, became cowardice. And it gets worse, because the next time you're in a crowd, the memory returns, but not as motivation, as permission. Last time, no one helped. Last time, nothing happened to you. So you wait again, and each time you do, it gets easier. The hesitation lasts longer. The silence feels more normal. Eventually, not helping stops feeling like a decision at all. You stop noticing the moment. You stop feeling it slip past. This is how kindness dies, not in one dramatic collapse, but slowly, through shared inaction, through the comfort of numbers, through the quiet reassurance that someone else will step in, even when they won't. The bystander effect is often described as a flaw in human psychology, a trick the brain plays when it sees too many eyes watching. But maybe that's too easy. Maybe it isn't a bug. Maybe it's something darker. Maybe it's a mirror, because what it shows you isn't a failure of instinct. It's the limit of your courage, the exact moment where your empathy gives up, the line you won't cross unless others cross it first. You imagine again the person on the ground, or the scream from the next room, or the sound of a crash nearby. In each version you wait a little too long, just long enough to avoid being first. Just long enough for someone else to act, or for no one to. And then you think about all the times this must be happening, right now, somewhere else. People watching something horrible unfold, unsure whether to move. And you realize that someone is always waiting. Someone is always hesitating. Someone is always choosing inaction, believing that inaction is neutral, but it isn't. In a crowd, inaction multiplies, it grows, it becomes the norm. And once it becomes normal, it begins to look like safety, like reason, like morality. And now the quiet question returns. What if your inaction didn't just fail to help? What if it helped others justify doing nothing too? What if your silence gave permission? What if your stillness encouraged theirs? Suddenly, you're not just a bystander, you're a signal. A guidepost that says it's okay to look away, it's okay to keep walking. And that's how kindness becomes cruelty, not by intent, not by malice, but through silence, through waiting, through looking around and seeing that no one else is helping, and deciding that means you don't have to either. The cruelty isn't in what you did, it's in what you didn't do, and how many people you taught, silently, to do the same.